Welcome to the historic Blah, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe, not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. Now we begin with Story 1, The Silent Architects, Embalming in Ancient Egypt. You are standing beside the Nile, perhaps sometime in the 18th dynasty during the reign of Amenhotep III. The river is quiet today, the papyrus reeds rustling gently. Somewhere nearby, a funeral procession winds toward the desert. You wouldn't notice it from afar unless you were looking black-clad mourners, men carrying wooden boxes, incense trailing in the breeze. The dead are making their way to the necropolis again, and behind the ornate rituals lies a trade practiced in private workshops and guarded with the kind of reverence normally reserved for priests. That trade is embalming. The ancient Egyptians did not invent mummification. Nature did. Before techniques were perfected, it was the arid sands that dried the bodies of the poor buried shallowly outside the villages. But eventually, the Egyptians chose to imitate what the earth had done. And so, through centuries of cautious experimentation and deepening theology, they constructed one of the most enduring systems of body preservation in human history. The embalmers were known as WT, a term rarely inscribed directly in tombs for reasons that remain obscure. Perhaps it was modesty or mystery. The profession wasn't glamorous, but it was sacred. Though they didn't hold the same public esteem as the priests or scribes, embalmers played a vital role in ensuring the smooth passage of the soul Ka and Ba into the afterlife. You see, the soul in Egyptian belief could not survive without the body. To destroy one was to doom the other. The hidden workshops. The embalmers operated on the west bank of the Nile where the sun sets and where the dead are buried. Workshops were often placed near necropolises like those in Saqqara or Thebes, though the actual buildings rarely survive. Inside, these workshops resembled surgical theaters more than tombs. They were equipped with oils, natron salts, knives made of obsidian or bronze, linen wrappings in bulk, wooden headrests, and painted masks. You might even find instructions scribbled on ostraca pottery shards, reused for notes. The process of mummification could take 70 days or more. And while there were variations over time and between social classes, a sort of canonical method had emerged by the New Kingdom. That method began with an act of sacrilege by modern standards, the removal of the brain. Through the nose, an iron hook was inserted and the brain, or as much of it as could be reached, was liquefied and drained. It is easy to misunderstand this as a crude process, but in truth, the embalmers saw little importance in the brain. Consciousness, intelligence, the seat of memory, these were all thought to reside in the heart, not the head. The brain was just something in the way. The heart and the scales. In contrast, the heart was sacred. It was the center of emotion, thought, and identity. To remove it would be unthinkable, at least at first. But over time, even this sacred organ began to be left out of some burials, replaced with symbolic scarabs or omitted due to changing ritual needs. Still, many embalmers left the heart intact, believing it would be weighed in the Hall of Mad, where the deceased's deeds would be measured against the feather of truth. Other organs, lungs, liver, stomach, intestines were carefully removed through an incision made on the left side of the abdomen, always the left. These organs were washed, dried with natron, and placed in canopic jars, each guarded by one of the four sons of Horus. Imseti, human-headed, protected the liver. Hapi, baboon-headed, the lungs. Duamutef, jackal-headed, the stomach, and Kebesenu, falcon-headed, the intestines. Over time, especially in later periods, the actual organs were sometimes omitted, and the jars used symbolically. In this, as in so much of ancient Egyptian practice, symbolism and ritual held equal or greater weight than practicality. Drying the body. With the internal organs removed, the body was filled with linen and packed in natron, a naturally occurring mixture of sodium carbonate and bicarbonate, sometimes mixed with salt. This process desiccated the body completely over a 40-day period. Imagine the embalmers rotating the body slightly every few days to ensure even drying, one of the countless mundane yet essential tasks in their invisible labor. After drying, the body was washed again, often in water laced with palm wine or fragrant oils, and then anointed with unguents that varied based on the family's wealth. Myrrh, frankincense, cedar oil, all were used, each believed to protect and purify the body. The body was then stuffed with sawdust, linen, or even resin-soaked cloth to give it a lifelike shape. The skin was painted or coated in resin, blackened like tar, sealing the corpse in its preserved shell. Wrapping the dead. Wrapping was not just a matter of practicality, it was sacred art. Each finger, each toe might be wrapped individually. Layers could number in the dozens. Amulets were inserted between bandages, scarabs for protection, jed pillars for stability, eyes of Horus for healing. Every layer carried a prayer. Embalmers chanted, perhaps quietly or perhaps only in their minds, as they wrapped and sealed the body in white linen. Faces were covered with masks, gold for pharaohs, painted cartonnage for others. The image of the dead was preserved so that the soul would recognize its vessel in eternity. Some mummies were adorned with false beards or painted eyes. Some had sandals or small statues of servants called shabti, who would work for them in the afterlife. Even the poorest were given at least a modest wrap, if not a full sarcophagus. By the end of the process, the deceased was no longer just a body. They were a Sa, a sacred being, no longer of this world but not yet of the next. The economic side of death. It is easy to think of Egyptian mummification in terms of grandeur, but it was also a business. There were different tiers of embalming services, from elite treatments costing a fortune to simpler burials where bodies were merely dried and buried in reed mats. Herodotus, the Greek historian, even described the embalmers offering customers a menu of mummification packages. This commodification of death might seem strange, but it reflected the deep-seated Egyptian belief that everyone pharaoh or farmer deserved some path to the afterlife. Whether a golden mask or a linen shroud, the aim was the same: to preserve the body so the soul could live forever. And still, one wonders what drove the embalmers to such care, such detail, such reverence. Was it faith, duty, or simply the knowledge that their work was the final hope of the living? What did it feel like to be one of them, unseen, but essential, working in quiet rooms as the world above went on? You are walking a dusty path near the necropolis of Saqqara. To your left rise the tiered layers of the step pyramid of Djoser, its weathered limestone blocks catching the harsh light of the Egyptian sun. To your right, scattered chapels and tomb entrances, some open, some sealed with spells, all whispering the same thing: that death here was not an end, but a transition. And this transition was managed by craftsmen whose names we rarely know. Behind the spiritual ideals of eternal life lay something much more mundane: an industry of death. In the New Kingdom and late periods especially, embalming was no longer just a religious rite, but an economic enterprise, structured and stratified. The temples regulated it, the priests officiated it, and the embalmers, often low-born and poorly regarded socially, did the actual work. Yet these workers, anonymous though they remain, were among the most skilled artisans of their time. Their tools were precise. Their understanding of human anatomy and chemistry, even if not formalized, was practical and advanced. And above all, their work served a sacred function in society, helping others achieve immortality. Death for sale, the business of burial. When a family member died, the grieving relatives would consult with mortuary priests or temple intermediaries to make arrangements. In Memphis, Thebes, and later in Alexandria, there were established death markets, not in the ghoulish sense, but as coordinated services. Embalmers, coffin makers, linen weavers, amulet carvers, and mask painters all formed an informal but intricate economic web. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, described embalmers offering three different price categories: the most expensive, a mid-tier package, and the least costly option. Although modern scholars debate the literalness of his description, archaeological evidence does show clear distinctions in quality of embalming and burial depending on class. At the top tier, a body might be prepared with imported resins, gilded masks, nested coffins, and lengthy funerary texts painted in delicate hieroglyphs. Middle-tier mummies might receive less extensive drying and fewer amulets, with cartonnage instead of gold leaf. Lower-tier burials might receive no more than a simple linen wrap and a pit dug in the sand, though even these often included charms and spells. This tiered system underscores a central truth about Egyptian spirituality. While all aspired to eternity, what that eternity looked like depended in part on what you could afford. Who were the embalmers? Despite their critical role in society, embalmers occupied a complicated place in Egyptian culture. They were both necessary and liminal guardians of sacred knowledge, yet handlers of death, which could render a person ritually unclean. Many embalmers worked under the authority of temple complexes, particularly those dedicated to Anubis, the jackal-headed god of embalming. They were likely organized into guilds or hereditary castes, passing down methods from father to son. Some may have held religious titles, others were simple artisans. Their names were almost never recorded except for a few cases where the deceased was himself an embalmer. One such example is the 26th dynasty priest Petasiris, whose tomb at Tuna el-Jebel includes inscriptions identifying his role in ritual preparation of bodies. Still, we know little about their daily lives. Did they live near the workshops? Did they maintain ritual purity through ablutions? What did they eat, think, believe? Did they grow numb to death, or did each body remind them of their own mortality? We do know that they were respected enough to be buried near their places of work, especially in embalmers' necropolises like those found in Saqqara and Thebes. Some embalmers even had their own miniature tombs with dedications from grateful clients, indicating a kind of quiet reverence. The temple's role. No embalmer worked in a vacuum. The temples, especially those connected to Osiris and Anubis, played a central role in overseeing mortuary practices. Temple priests supervised funerary rites, dictated the theological framework, and ensured that the rituals adhered to sacred texts like the Book of the Dead, the Opening of the Mouth, and Amjuat. In the temple economy, embalmers often acted as subcontractors. They might rent space within temple lands, receive payments for their services in grain or goods, and participate in festivals for the dead. It was the temple, after all, that held the sacred texts, provided access to holy oils, and owned the land on which mummification workshops and tombs were built. In the city of Abydos, believed to be the burial place of Osiris himself, the temple system controlled large tracts of mortuary real estate. Pilgrims paid to be buried there, or at least to have a cenotaph, a symbolic tomb that linked them to Osiris's eternal cycle. Some embalmers may have specialized in preparing bodies for these elite burials, often carried out far from the deceased's actual home. Sacred rituals and practical realities. Once the body was prepared, it had to be consecrated. The opening of the mouth ceremony was the most important. A priest, sometimes wearing a mask of Anubis, would touch a ritual adze to the eyes and lips of the mummy, symbolically restoring the senses so the deceased could speak and see in the afterlife. This ceremony could be elaborate or minimal, depending again on the family's means. But its presence, even in its most stripped-down form, shows the vital link between physical preparation and spiritual readiness. Without it, the soul could become lost, confused, or trapped. Then came burial, sometimes days or weeks after the ceremony, depending on the alignment of festivals and lunar calendars. In wealthier cases, processions with musicians, incense bearers, and mourners would travel from the workshop to the tomb. For others, the burial might be simple and quiet, done at dawn or dusk to avoid the desert heat. The body was laid in its tomb, often alongside food offerings, Shabti figurines, and funerary texts. A stone or wooden stele might be erected outside, carved with invocations and prayers. And then the tomb was sealed. But the embalmer's job wasn't quite done. Sometimes, families returned to the workshop weeks later to ask for additional rituals, maintenance of tombs, or interpretation of dreams they believed came from the deceased. In this way, the embalmer wasn't just a technician. He was a lifelong companion to the soul. An industry that lasted millennia. What's astonishing is how long this system endured. From the Old Kingdom, around 2600 BCE, through to the Greco-Roman period, as late as 400 CE, the art of embalming evolved but never disappeared. Techniques changed, resins became more common, bandaging methods more elaborate, but the core purpose remained: preservation for eternity. There were regional styles, too. Mummies from the Theban region often have dark, resinous coatings. Those from Lower Egypt sometimes show finer linen work. Some even show signs of experimentation with body positioning, amulet placement, or facial sculpting. By the time of the Ptolemies and Romans, mummification had absorbed foreign influences. Portrait masks painted on wooden panels, now known as Fayum mummy portraits, blended Egyptian ritual with Greco-Roman realism. And yet, even in these hybrid forms, the embalmer's hand is clear. The goal was the same: to guide the body toward eternity. But in this quiet, enduring industry, we are left with a central mystery. For every golden sarcophagus in a museum, there are hundreds, perhaps thousands, of anonymous mummies buried in the sands, their names and stories lost. And for every anonymous mummy, there were embalmers who worked in silence, performing rituals by lamplight, never knowing whether their efforts would last or be forgotten. What becomes of a person's soul when even their name is no longer remembered? You stand now not in ancient Saqqara or Thebes, but inside the echoing halls of the British Museum. The lighting is soft, the air is dry. In front of you lies a glass case, behind it the dark, shriveled remains of a man once buried in reverence, wrapped in linen, anointed with sacred oils, protected by spells. Tourists pass by, some pausing, some whispering, some barely noticing. The embalmer's work endures, but out of place and out of time. This is the modern afterlife of Egypt's mummies. From the moment Europeans first began removing mummies from tombs in the 17th and 18th centuries, the embalmed dead of Egypt have experienced a second kind of preservation as spectacle. Their spiritual journey, intended to continue in the fields of reeds, was interrupted, caught in the limbo of display cabinets, scientific curiosity, and colonial possession. Rediscovery and dissection. The 19th century saw a frenzy of Egyptomania. Wealthy European collectors purchased mummies by the dozens, sometimes to be unwrapped in drawing rooms as a form of parlor entertainment. These mummy unwrapping parties, both theatrical and destructive, often failed to record the names, dates, or even locations of the bodies they desecrated. For the Victorians, mummies were objects of exoticism, of mystery and morbid curiosity. But their ancient purpose, spiritual immortality, was often ignored. Removed from their tombs, stripped of their protective amulets and coffins, many of these individuals lost the very identity their embalmers had fought to preserve. At the same time, scientists and archaeologists began studying mummies in earnest. Anatomists dissected them to learn about disease, diet, and bone structure. Some researchers were driven by a sincere desire to understand ancient Egyptian life. Others were less respectful. In one recorded case, mummy linen was even pulped to make paper. In another, mummy dust was sold as a medicinal powder. These indignities were, perhaps, inevitable in a world that had lost its belief in the sacredness of the dead. The survival of the technique. Yet despite this, the work of the embalmers continues to astonish. Modern technology, CT scans, DNA testing, forensic reconstruction has allowed researchers to unwrap mummies without touching them. In doing so, they have confirmed what ancient observers already suspected. Egyptian embalmers were meticulous, methodical, and astonishingly skilled. Some mummies show signs of advanced dental work, cranial surgery, and even prosthetics. Others reveal diseases still present today: arthritis, abscesses, parasites. Embalmers often adjusted their techniques to compensate for bodily damage, reconstructing limbs or reshaping features so the soul would not lose its home. New studies show that resin mixtures used by embalmers were complex blends of conifer oils, animal fats, beeswax, and bitumen. In one recent finding, researchers discovered traces of ingredients imported from as far away as Southeast Asia. This suggests not only technical skill, but participation in vast trade networks. All of this serves to reinforce a simple truth: the embalmers were more than just tradesmen. They were chemists, artists, theologians, and surgeons operating within a cosmology that stretched from the Nile Delta to the heavens themselves. Mummification in decline. As Christianity spread into Egypt, mummification declined. By the 4th century CE, the practice had largely disappeared, replaced by Christian burials and a theology that emphasized resurrection through divine grace rather than bodily preservation. The embalmers, once quiet custodians of eternity, faded into memory. Their workshops closed, their tools discarded or buried. The knowledge that had been passed down for millennia through generations who memorized the feel of skin under linen, the smell of resin, the order of ritual was lost. No books recorded it. No secrets were written down. It simply vanished, buried with the last mummified bodies of the old gods. And yet, in a strange way, their work continues. The mummies remain. In museums, universities, private collections, and, in rare cases, still buried in forgotten tombs, the embalmers' final works still exist. Thousands of years after their deaths, the preserved bodies remain intact, faces frozen in dark repose, hands crossed as if still waiting to rise again. What other ancient technology has endured so visibly, so stubbornly? The ethical questions of the present. Today, the question of what to do with these mummies is the subject of intense debate. Some argue that they should be studied, for their bodies contain invaluable clues to history, medicine, and culture. Others say they should be reburied, left in peace, their spiritual journeys respected after centuries of disturbance. Museums walk a difficult line. Some have removed mummies from display or placed them behind screens with accompanying explanations. Others present them openly, alongside reconstructed coffins and digital animations. But for every effort at contextualization, there is still the basic fact: these are people, not objects. Some Egyptian voices today call for the return of royal mummies to their homeland. Others support their study, seeing them as part of Egypt's national identity. In either case, it is clear that the embalmers' task preserving identity beyond death has created dilemmas even they could never have imagined. The final reflection. And so, we return to the embalmer, perhaps a man named Kai, or Menina, or perhaps a woman whose name has vanished, who once stood in the shadows of a small mud-brick workshop near the edge of the desert. She would not have thought of herself as famous. Her linen bandages were plain, her knives dull from use, her hands cracked from resin and salt. But her work has endured where kings and empires have fallen. She knew each body intimately, knew the shape of its jaw, the place where the liver lay, the feel of its last breath frozen in the chest. And she wrapped it in silence, hoping it would last forever. Now, in the stillness of the museum or the dust of a forgotten tomb, her handiwork lies waiting. still whole, still bearing witness to a belief that the body mattered, that even the most ordinary life deserved to be remembered. And perhaps that is the most remarkable thing. In a world where memory fades, where names are lost, and where time grinds down even the sharpest monuments, the embalmers of ancient Egypt left something behind, not just preserved flesh, but a question. A question we can still ask, thousands of years later, standing before the linen-wrapped dead. What does it mean to live forever if no one remembers your name? Story 2. Salt, Smoke, and Saints, the monastic mummies of Capuchin catacombs. You descend a narrow staircase beneath a quiet friary on the outskirts of Palermo, Sicily. The air grows cool and still, dust softening each step. As your eyes adjust to the dim light, you find yourself in a long corridor lined not with bricks or plaster, but with human bodies. They hang in niches and lie in open alcoves, some dressed in tattered monastic robes, others in the clothes they once wore in life, frozen in solemn silence. You have entered the Capuchin catacombs. Here, hundreds of mummified monks, clergy, children, and laypeople stand in posthumous vigil. Some tilt their heads forward in what seems like humility, others appear to gaze beyond time. This is not a grave, it is a gallery of the dead. But how did this strange place come to be? Why preserve the bodies at all? And what did the Capuchin friars hope to achieve in this quiet chamber of mortality? To answer that, we must turn to the late 16th century, to a time of Catholic reform and a curious intersection of theology, humility, and technique. The Capuchins, a humble order with lofty beliefs. The Capuchins were a branch of the Franciscan order, founded in the early 16th century as part of a movement to return to the original ideals of poverty and piety preached by Saint Francis of Assisi. Their brown robes and pointed hoods gave them their name Cappuccio, meaning hood, and their appearance was meant to reflect austerity, not fashion. They sought simplicity in life and humility in death. Yet, ironically, it was this very commitment to poverty and reflection on mortality that gave rise to one of Europe's most enduringly macabre legacies, the public preservation and display of the dead. Initially, the friars buried their dead in common graves beneath the monastery in Palermo. But around 1599, they exhumed several bodies during an expansion effort and discovered something remarkable. Among the corpses was one Brother Silvestro of Gubbio, whose body had been naturally mummified by the dry, cool conditions of the subterranean crypt. The friars saw this not as coincidence, but as a sign, perhaps even divine. Brother Silvestro had lived a humble life. That his body resisted decay was taken as evidence of his sanctity. This discovery sparked the beginning of a tradition to preserve the bodies of select friars and, eventually, lay patrons in the cool, dry catacombs beneath the church. A new kind of cemetery. At first, the preservation was limited to Capuchin monks, whose bodies were laid in simple robes in niches along the walls. But over the next 2 centuries, the practice expanded. Wealthy laypeople, nobles, merchants, even children petitioned for the honor of resting alongside the monks. Each body was positioned carefully, sometimes upright and secured with wires or wooden frames, sometimes lying in coffins with glass covers. Categories were created: priests in one corridor, men in another, women and virgins in another still. Children were placed in a special section, often clothed in frilly white dresses or miniature suits. There was no effort to disguise death here. Skin shriveled and blackened, mouths gaped, eyes sank into hollow sockets. The Capuchins did not preserve their dead for beauty. They preserved them to remind the living of their fate. Inscribed over the entrance was a simple phrase: "What you are now, we once were. What we are now, you shall be." It was not a threat, but a mirror. The preservation process. The techniques used by the Capuchins were not as complex as those of the Egyptians, but they were surprisingly effective. Once a friar or layperson had died, their body would be placed in a specially constructed drying room known as the collatoio, a chamber with stone slabs and air vents that allowed moisture to evaporate slowly over the course of several months. In some cases, the bodies were washed with vinegar or lye. Others were treated with arsenic or lime. Sometimes, the internal organs were removed, but not always. After the drying period, the bodies were dressed in their earthly garments, whether simple monastic robes or aristocratic finery, and then placed in their niches for display. The relative aridity and stable temperature of the underground crypts helped prevent decomposition, but it was not foolproof. Over time, many of the bodies collapsed or crumbled. Some were maintained, redressed, or reposed. Others were left to decay slowly in their niches, silent, dark witnesses to time. Theological meaning: why preserve the body? To the modern eye, the Capuchin catacombs might seem grotesque or even disrespectful. But for the friars, the preservation of the body was an extension of their belief in humility, reflection, and divine judgment. In Catholic tradition, the body is not a mere vessel. It is part of the whole person, destined one day for resurrection. By preserving the body, the Capuchins expressed hope in that future, while also confronting the living with the impermanence of worldly life. These were not shrines for veneration. The friars did not worship the dead. Instead, they used the mummies as instruments of memento mori, reminders of death meant to humble the proud, comfort the poor, and redirect attention to eternity. Visitors to the catacombs, even in earlier centuries, often reported feelings of awe and quietude. It was not horror they described, but reflection. And the friars themselves continued to live above this gallery of the dead, praying, eating, aging, and eventually joining those below. It was a cycle they accepted, embraced even. The expanding role of the catacombs. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the catacombs became something more than a monastic cemetery. As word spread, wealthy families began to request interment in the crypts. For a donation to the monastery, they could secure a niche for a deceased relative. Some even added clauses to their wills requesting periodic upkeep or replacement of clothing. This transformed the catacombs into a strange intersection of spiritual devotion and social status. A well-preserved body in fine clothes signaled both piety and prestige. In some cases, entire family lines were represented, generations resting together in silence. And yet, despite this influx of laity, the monks maintained the original message. The catacombs remained a place of humility, not grandeur. Even the best-dressed corpse was still, ultimately, dust in waiting. Rosalia Lombardo, the sleeping child. Among all the figures in the catacombs, one draws more attention than any other. Rosalia Lombardo, a 2-year-old girl who died in 1920 from pneumonia. Her grieving father, heartbroken, commissioned one of the last known mummification specialists, Alfredo Salafia, to preserve her body. Using a mixture of formalin, zinc salts, glycerin, and salicylic acid, Salafia created what is perhaps the most eerily lifelike mummy in the world. Rosalia lies in a small glass coffin, her blonde curls still visible, her cheeks soft and full. She looks not dead, but merely asleep. Her presence marked the end of the catacombs' active use. Shortly afterward, the practice of public mummification and display was officially discontinued. And so, with Rosalia, the doors of the catacombs were symbolically closed. What began as a simple act of humility with Brother Silvestro came to a quiet end with a sleeping child. The Capuchin catacombs today remain open to the public, a place of pilgrimage for some, of curiosity for others. The friars still live and pray above, their monastic routines echoing those of centuries past. But beneath, the preserved dead continue their vigil, silent monks and nobles alike, caught in the paradox of being remembered not in life, but in death. As you emerge from the crypt and return to the light of day, a question lingers. What does it mean for death to teach the living, when the living no longer believe in the lessons of the dead? You return again to the underground hush of the catacombs. The bodies do not move, but their presence surrounds you. Row after row, corridor after corridor, they stand, a congregation of the long dead, dressed in habits, waistcoats, dresses, and veils. They are not arranged at random. They follow an order, a structure. This was not a crypt of chaos, but a deliberate spiritual map laid out by the living to guide the dead. In this section, we explore the rituals and beliefs that govern not just how these bodies were preserved, but how they were honored, maintained, and occasionally reintroduced into the lives of the living. While the bodies no longer spoke, their presence remained active in the religious imagination of those who left flowers, wrote prayers, or whispered to them in passing. This was a space where death became familiar, even domestic, a space where theology met flesh. The organization of the dead. The Capuchin catacombs were not built to be labyrinthine or chaotic. Their organization reflects deep religious and social values. The layout follows monastic logic: humility, discipline, order. Each corridor has a name and function. The monk corridor. Reserved for Capuchin friars, this section contains the oldest mummies, some dating to the 16th century. Many are clothed in the rough brown robes of the order, with rope belts still tied at the waist, hoods collapsed against leathery skulls. The clergy corridor. Here lie priests and bishops, often dressed in ecclesiastical garb. Some hold rosaries or wear embroidered stoles. These were men of spiritual authority, preserved in their ritual dignity. The professionals corridor. Merchants, doctors, lawyers, and academics, often dressed in the fashion of their day, inhabit this space. These figures display the tension between humility and status that characterized much of 18th and 19th century Sicilian society. The women's corridor, divided further into virgins and matrons. This section houses women dressed in lace, silk, and occasionally bridal attire. While some appear plainly dressed, others wear jewelry, ribbons, or delicate shoes. The children's niche. Among the most emotionally striking spaces, here lie the youngest dead. Tiny garments, hand-stitched caps, and miniature boots remain, some made with loving care even as mourning set in. This organization reveals more than just order. It reflects values. Virginity, vocation, and class were all maintained even after death, preserved in textile and bone. A place of the living dead. To modern eyes, a crypt filled with bodies might seem a place to avoid. Yet in Palermo's past, this was not so. The Capuchin catacombs were a place people visited not only out of curiosity, but for comfort, prayer, even affection. Families would return regularly to visit the remains of relatives. Some kissed the cheeks of loved ones, replaced wilted flowers or freshened garments. In some cases, families paid a small fee to the friars to ensure the body remained well-maintained, clothing replaced, dust wiped away, limbs repositioned. The dead were not abandoned. They were watched over. And not just in memory. Some believed the spirits of the preserved remained nearby, able to offer intercession, protection, or warnings. Dreams featuring the dead were taken seriously. A dry whisper in sleep, a cold brush of air at night, a shadow in a chapel. These were not just superstition but signals, interpreted with care. Funeral rites and admission to the crypts. The process of admission to the catacombs was itself a ritual. While not all who asked were granted a place, many were. The process began with death but continued with careful negotiation. After death, the body would be prepared, as described in Section 1, with drying, washing, and in later periods, chemical embalming. Once dried, the corpse was dressed, often in its finest clothes. For monks, this meant their habit. For laypeople, it might be wedding clothes, ceremonial uniforms, or simply a beloved outfit. The symbolism was layered. One was buried not only as oneself, but as how one wished to be remembered. The interment ceremony could be simple or elaborate. In some cases, entire communities processed into the crypt to witness the final placement. Prayers were said, hymns sung. The friars oversaw the rites, treating the moment with the same dignity they offered the living liturgy. Even after burial, the relationship continued. If a body began to deteriorate or fall from its niche, families could request it be resecured, redressed, or placed in a glass coffin. The dead, here, had a kind of second life, still part of the community, though mute. The role of the friars. Above ground, the friars continued their daily rhythms: lauds, vespers, compline. They baked bread, served the poor, tended the garden. But below, they remained caretakers of a spiritual museum, not as curators of spectacle, but guardians of memory. They swept the corridors, monitored humidity, and adjusted lighting in later centuries. They prayed daily for the souls of those entombed, reading aloud from scriptures, invoking saints, and offering Mass for the repose of the preserved. In doing so, they expressed a belief often lost in modern burial practices: that death was not an end, but a transition requiring continued support. The friars did not see the mummies as curiosities. They were brothers and sisters, part of the same mystical body of the Church. Pilgrimage and the curious visitor. By the late 18th century, the Capuchin catacombs began to attract more than family and friends. Pilgrims came, drawn by stories of incorruptibility and reverence. Later, tourists arrived, English, French, German, some horrified, others fascinated. Writers recorded their impressions in journals. Some called the place a vision of Dante, others a theater of piety. The catacombs became part of the grand tour, a macabre counterpoint to Rome's ruins or Florence's paintings. This exposure, however, led to a gradual shift. While still a sacred space, the catacombs became increasingly shaped by the gaze of outsiders. Some visitors offered money to photograph or study the remains. Others simply stared. Over time, the boundary between veneration and voyeurism blurred. Saints among the shadows. Although the Capuchin catacombs were never officially designated as a shrine for saints, some bodies gained informal reputations for sanctity. Stories circulated about incorruptibility: a friar whose body never decayed, a child whose eyes seemed to open on feast days, a noblewoman whose fragrance lingered decades after death. Most of these stories remain unverifiable, passed through whispers and oral tradition. But they reflect something deeper: a human desire to see death not only as an end, but as a sign, something that hints at holiness, transcendence, or peace. And in a way, these beliefs were consistent with the Christian theology of the body. Not every body was a saint, but every body was sacred. Even the most decayed figure, still garbed in crumbling linen, held within it the memory of baptism, the hope of resurrection. Time and deterioration. Despite preservation, time still had its way. Bodies decayed, dust settled, mice occasionally intruded. Earthquakes disturbed the alignment of walls and alcoves. The friars did what they could, but entropy was patient. By the early 20th century, the catacombs had reached capacity. No more bodies were admitted, and in time, maintenance became less frequent. The friars grew fewer, the rituals slowed, and eventually the catacombs passed from a living tradition into a historical one. Today, preservation efforts are overseen by museum staff and local cultural authorities. Climate control, digital mapping, and ethical reviews guide the care of what remains. But the friars still pray above. Their chants echo faintly down the stairs, like a memory held in stone. And so we arrive at a quiet paradox. In attempting to preserve death, the Capuchins ended up preserving life, not just the lives of individuals, but a vision of how communities once understood the body, memory, and eternity. It's not just the bodies that endure, but the intentions behind them. Even now, as you turn to leave the crypt, passing one last friar in his crumbling robes, the question hangs: what is more enduring, the flesh carefully preserved, or the faith that led someone to preserve it at all? The catacombs are dark now. Tourists have gone. The lights dim to save what's left of fragile bone and cloth. If you stood here alone in the narrow corridor where friars and nobles hang side by side, the silence would feel thick, ancient, almost tangible. A silence not of absence but of presence, because the dead here do not vanish, they endure. But for how long and why? In this final section of the story, we examine the modern legacy of the Capuchin catacombs, not just their physical condition or tourist traffic, but the deeper ethical and philosophical questions they pose. What is the role of memory? Who owns the past? And what happens when death becomes history and history becomes spectacle? From sacred to secular, when death meets display. By the mid-20th century, the catacombs had fully entered the public imagination. Guidebooks listed them alongside cathedrals and palaces. Photographs of the friars' preserved bodies began appearing in magazines and academic journals. Documentaries and travel programs aired footage of Rosalia Lombardo, the sleeping beauty of Palermo, and the skeletal remains of once powerful nobles, dressed in their final finery. And yet, a subtle shift had occurred. What was once intended as a spiritual confrontation with mortality, a memento mori, had become, for many, a curiosity. The dead were no longer monks and mothers but exhibits. Tourists whispered, pointed, and occasionally laughed. Though most were respectful, a few posed for photos or reached through railings. It begged a question that has only grown more urgent in recent years. At what point does preservation become exploitation? Cultural heritage or disturbance of the dead? Today, the Capuchin catacombs are officially classified as a cultural heritage site. They are managed by the church in partnership with regional conservation authorities. Visitor access is permitted, but increasingly regulated. Photography is restricted. Climate control systems attempt to balance the dry air needed for preservation with the need to protect what little remains of textiles, hair, and skin. Still, debate continues. Some argue the catacombs should be closed to the public entirely. They are a cemetery, after all, a place of burial. No one, the critics say, would accept such public display for a modern family member. Why then allow it for the friars and children of centuries past? Others claim that these mummified bodies are valuable to science, history, and faith. They offer unmatched insights into early preservation techniques, social customs, and spiritual values. Removing them from view, they argue, would erase the very lessons the Capuchins intended to impart. And still others, perhaps the most thoughtful of all, occupy the middle ground. They ask for balance. Access, yes, but with reverence. Study, yes, but with consent in mind. But whose consent can be given when the voices that mattered have long since faded? The case of Rosalia Lombardo. Among all these bodies, Rosalia Lombardo remains the most debated. Her preservation is so perfect, so eerily lifelike that she appears to defy time. Her skin is smooth, her hair neatly parted, her lips delicately closed in eternal slumber. Recent time-lapse footage even suggested her eyelids moved, though it was later explained as a trick of humidity and light. But even with scientific explanation, her lifelike appearance sparks a unique discomfort. She does not look like a mummy. She looks like a child peacefully asleep in a crib. For some visitors, this evokes awe. For others, unease. Should a child who never asked to be a relic lie beneath glass, centuries after her death, visited by strangers from around the world? Her family likely believed they were honoring her memory. Perhaps they hoped she would be remembered, preserved, even venerated. And indeed she has been. But her role has shifted. No longer a daughter, she is now an icon of preservation, a symbol of beauty in death. It raises yet another question. Can remembrance unintentionally obscure identity? The science of preservation versus the theology of decay. There's a paradox here, one that may be uncomfortable to face. The Capuchins preserved bodies to remind the living of their own mortality, to humble them, to bring them closer to spiritual contemplation. Yet modern science and tourism preserves these bodies further, often to delay decay, to freeze them in a kind of clinical eternity. But in Catholic theology, resurrection does not require a perfectly preserved body. Decay is not a failure, it is part of the natural order. From dust you came, and to dust you shall return. The Capuchins did not aim to cheat death. They did not mummify out of fear. They preserved the body only long enough for its lesson to be taught, for the truth to sink in. What happens then when preservation becomes an end in itself? When the silent faces become research subjects or photo ops, rather than witnesses to the faith that once filled their lives? Do we risk losing the very message the Capuchins hope to send? Lessons from the stillness. And yet, even now, the catacombs remain a place where people pause. Tourists grow quiet as they descend. Children ask hesitant questions. Some visitors cry not from fear, but from recognition. Recognition that death, though uncomfortable, is universal. That bodies, stripped of movement and voice, still bear traces of love, vocation, humility. One figure wears a worn rosary, its beads faded but intact. Another clutches a small book. Another still is dressed in her wedding gown, veil resting over a collapsed face, a gesture of hope that outlived the flesh. They remind us not just of death, but of life lived with meaning. In this way, the catacombs remain effective. The dead, preserved not for beauty but for humility, continue to speak though not in words. Preservation as pilgrimage. For many Sicilians, especially older generations, the catacombs are not just a tourist destination. They are part of the region's spiritual geography. Schoolchildren once visited them as part of religious education. Elderly parishioners remember attending services with the knowledge that generations rested below. There is something intimate in this arrangement, a vertical layering of life and death, the living above, the dead below, not gone but waiting. In this framework, the catacombs are less a horror and more a companion, a kind of extended family photograph, however faded. One friar, when asked if he ever feared working above the catacombs, smiled gently and said, "They are our brothers. They remind us that we are not far behind." The future of the catacombs. As time progresses, the Capuchin catacombs face practical and ethical crossroads. Conservation experts warn that even with modern techniques, deterioration is inevitable. Textiles fray, bones crack, microorganisms feed on long-dried tissue. Sooner or later, nature reclaims its own. Digitization may offer one solution: high-resolution scans, virtual tour, interactive reconstructions. But these too raise questions. Does a digital mummy honor the real person? Or does it simply sanitize what was once profound? Religious voices call for renewed reverence. Some ask for more prayers, others for reburial, and still others advocate for continued education so that the catacombs might serve not only the curious but the contemplative. But perhaps the most enduring legacy is this: that a community of humble friars, seeking to live and die with dignity, created a space where death was not denied, not hidden, but integrated into the very architecture of life. And so, as we leave this story behind, these salt-dried friars, these black-robed children, these slumbering saints in silence, we are left with a final reflection. What does it say about us, that we try so hard to preserve the dead, but so often forget to truly honor the lives they once lived? Story 3. Whispers in the Ice. The frozen bodies of the Siberian steppe. You are standing on the cold, windswept plateau of the Altai Mountains. All around is silence, broken only by the rasp of snow against the rock. The air is thin. The earth, when uncovered, is mostly permafrost, solid, unyielding. But once this land was a highway of movement and ritual. Once beneath this ice, people buried their dead in wood-lined chambers, surrounded by horses, gold, wool, and weaponry. And the ice, perhaps the most faithful of all custodians, preserved them. Among these discoveries, None has captivated archaeologists more than the frozen mummies of the Pazyryk culture. Tattooed warriors, noblewomen, and sacrificial horses interred more than 2,400 years ago. Their tombs were not monuments built to last in stone, but hidden vaults of wood and soil, accidentally frozen and perfectly preserved by the Siberian cold. Here begins the story of those who lived and died in a world that whispered to the skis, rode with the herds, and met death not as a loss but as a ceremonial crossing. Discovery in the frost. In 1929, a Soviet archaeologist named Sergei Rudenko began excavating burial mounds, or kurgans, in the Altai region. What he found would rewrite the understanding of Iron Age nomadic life. The Pazyryk people, semi-nomadic tribes who thrived around the 5th to 3rd centuries BCE, left behind no written records, but in their burials elaborate, symbolic, and often astonishingly preserved they told a quiet but vivid story. One of Rudenko's most remarkable finds came in 1949, the body of a tattooed man, laid in a wooden coffin inside a chamber beneath a mound of stones. His clothing, made of wool and felt, was still intact. His body had been embalmed, his flesh marked with intricate animal tattoos. Around him were sacrificed horses, richly adorned, buried as companions for the afterlife. How had such preservation occurred? The answer was in the climate. Water from rain and snow had seeped into the tombs and frozen solid, encasing the dead in icy tombs, untouched by time or rot. Unlike the Egyptian deserts or Christian crypts, here, nature itself had taken on the role of embalmer. Who were the Pazyryk? The Pazyryk culture is still somewhat mysterious. They were part of the larger Scythian world, a loose confederation of steppe tribes stretching from Eastern Europe to Central Asia. They left no cities, no books, and few monuments. But what they lacked in stone, they made up for in craft. They were equestrian people, deeply connected to their horses, which were often ritually sacrificed and buried with their riders. They were master textile producers. Fragments of woolen carpets, felt boots, and embroidered clothing have been recovered, astonishingly vibrant even after 2 millennia underground. They were also skilled in metalwork. Burial sites contain golden ornaments, iron tools, bronze mirrors, and weapons. The art reflects a culture steeped in animal symbolism: deer, panthers, eagles, and mythical creatures rendered in fluid, almost dreamlike designs. The tombs themselves, known as kurgans, were large circular mounds built over deep pits. These chambers were lined with larch wood, filled with grave goods, and sealed with stones. The higher the mound, the more important the person buried within. These were not crude burials. They were cosmological statements, symbolic structures tying earth, sky, spirit, and body into one coherent system. The Ice Maiden. In 1993, another discovery stirred international fascination: the so-called Siberian Ice Maiden, unearthed by Natalia Polizmak on the Yukok Plateau. This mummy, believed to be that of a high-status woman, possibly a priestess, was found in a richly decorated burial chamber. Her body was elaborately tattooed with deer-like creatures, their limbs flowing into floral patterns. She wore a tall, feathered headdress, and her coffin was carved from a single tree. She was buried not with weapons but with symbols of ritual and status: mirrors, wooden dishes, and fine textiles. Around her lay 6 horses, each with its own ornate harness. The body had been embalmed and then frozen by the permafrost, preserving not just skin and muscle, but even brain tissue. Her face, still and pale, revealed delicate features, a waxy stillness, a silence that had held for 2,400 years. And yet, with her discovery came unease. Reverence or disturbance. The local Altai people, many of whom are indigenous descendants of the region's ancient inhabitants, viewed the Ice Maiden's removal as a desecration. For them, she was not a scientific object but a sacred ancestor. Her disturbance was believed to have angered the spirits of the land. In the years following her excavation, local shamans and elders blamed a series of regional misfortunes, earthquakes, livestock deaths, and severe weather on the disinterment. A growing movement called for her return. Eventually, the Ice Maiden was moved to a specially constructed museum in the Altai Republic's capital of Gorno-Altisk. Visitors may now view her through glass, her tattoos still visible beneath the frost-preserved skin. But the ethical question remains. What is gained by preserving a person who never asked to be remembered this way? And what is lost when spiritual meaning is replaced by scientific observation? The tattoos, symbols of power and passage. The tattoos found on Pazyryk mummies are among the oldest examples of body art in the world. They are not decorative in the modern sense. They are symbolic, perhaps even talismanic. The Ice Maiden's tattoos depict horned deer with feline paws and griffin-like features. On the arms of other mummies, especially warriors, there are stylized rams, birds, and mountain goats. These animals were believed to have spiritual properties, acting as guides, protectors, or expressions of power. In death, tattoos may have served as identifiers for the soul in the afterlife. Perhaps they were meant to make the dead visible to the spirits, or perhaps they simply honored the animal forces the living admired in life. What is certain is that these were not casual markings. They were etched into flesh with deep intention. The frozen moment. What sets the Siberian mummies apart is not just their preservation, but the world they froze in place. When you look at the face of the tattooed warrior or the embroidered cloth of the Ice Maiden, you're not seeing an artist's reconstruction. You are seeing a moment frozen at the point of burial. The dirt, the fibers, the posture of the hands, it is all exactly as it was when the tomb was sealed. This offers archaeologists a rare, almost intrusive privilege, the ability to witness a culture at the moment it said goodbye. No later tomb robbers, no floods, no bacteria, just silence and snow and time. And so, as the wind moves once again across the empty steppe, we are left with a quiet tension. These frozen dead, sealed in honor and ritual, have become subjects of fascination far beyond what they could have imagined. Their preservation speaks not just to the cold, but to the warmth of a culture that treated death with beauty, order, and care. But we must ask, is the ice a blessing that preserved a people's memory, or a mirror reflecting how fragile remembrance truly is, when the voices are gone? You return once more to the wind-beaten tundra of the Altai Mountains, where snow creeps into every crevice, and the silence of ages weighs heavily on the land. Beneath this frozen soil lie the tombs of a people who lived without palaces or monuments, but whose legacy endures not in bronze or marble, but in the quiet clarity of ice. The Pazyryk mummies speak to us through their bodies, and in this section, we delve into what those bodies reveal, not just about burial, but about society, sacrifice, kinship, and how the Pazyryk understood the strange border between the living and the dead. Because theirs was not a civilization of conquest, it was one of cycles, seasonal, spiritual, and symbolic. The chambered dead, what lies beneath? The Pazyryk tombs, known as kurgans, were more than graves. They were orchestrated spaces where every object and gesture had a place. A typical tomb consisted of a deep pit lined with larch logs, a locally sourced timber selected for its strength and longevity. The body, wrapped in felt and wool, was laid in a wooden coffin, often carved, sometimes decorated. Around it were placed horses, tools, garments, food offerings, and ornaments. Many of the tombs include not just one body, but several. A primary figure, male or female, accompanied by servants, attendants, and sacrificed animals. In one particularly large kurgan, archaeologists found the remains of 14 horses buried alongside a single person. Each horse had been carefully prepared, shaved, adorned with intricate bridles, saddles, and ornamental coverings. Some had carved wooden antlers strapped to their heads, a transformation of horse into symbolic reindeer or otherworldly creatures. Their deaths were not random. They were ritualized, purposeful. And this begs a question. What kind of afterlife required this kind of preparation? The world beyond, the Pazyryk cosmos. The Pazyryk left no written cosmology, but through their burial practices, artwork, and comparative mythology, scholars have reconstructed a rough map of their spiritual beliefs. The steppe peoples believed in a three-tiered universe: the upper world of sky and spirits, the middle world of the living, and the lower world of the dead. Shamans were the mediators between these realms, and animals, particularly horses and deer, served as spiritual vehicles. Burial, then, was not the end, but the beginning of a journey. The inclusion of horses in the tomb wasn't symbolic, it was functional. The deceased would ride these animals through the thresholds of the worlds. The decorations, clothing, and tools were not tributes, but gear for travel. Even the tattoos, antlered beasts with flowing bodies, may have served as passports or protectors for the spirit. In this worldview, death was less a rupture than a migration. Sacrifice and companionship. The presence of human attendants in some tombs, typically younger individuals buried with fewer grave goods, raises unsettling questions. Were these people sacrificed to accompany the dead, or were they already deceased? And if sacrificed, was it considered an honor? The archaeological record is inconclusive. In some cases, skeletal trauma or positions suggest a violent death. In others, the bodies appear to have been interred with care, with their own garments and even jewelry. It's possible these were family members' wives, servants, or companions offered in what might have been seen not as loss, but as continuity. In a world governed by cycles, to accompany the dead into the next realm may not have been tragic. It may have been expected. Still, for the modern observer, the ethics feel uneasy. We are left to wonder. Did they choose this path willingly, or was choice irrelevant in a world governed by ritual? Gender and power in the tombs. Contrary to many expectations, the Pazyryk tombs reveal significant roles for women. The Ice Maiden is only the most famous of several high-status female burials found in the region. Others include women buried with weapons, horses, and elaborate grave goods. This suggests that women in Pazyryk society could hold positions of authority, possibly as spiritual leaders or tribal elders. Some scholars propose that the Ice Maiden was a Kam, or shaman, based on her tattoos and lack of weapons, replaced instead by symbols of vision and insight. Interestingly, the female mummies often display more complex tattooing than their male counterparts. Was this a marker of rank, a sign of spiritual function? In a culture that viewed death as a journey, perhaps women were the guides, the seers who prepared the path. The language of objects. The Pazyryk buried their dead with astonishing objects, many of which have survived intact. These weren't just tools or decorations. They were messages, part of a visual language that communicated status, identity, and intention. Some of the most exquisite items include appliqued felt carpets, geometric and floral patterns, animal motifs, and warrior scenes sewn with fine detail. Bronze mirrors, often placed near the head, perhaps symbolizing self-reflection or spiritual sight. Gold ornaments, adorned with griffins, elk, and eagles, creatures associated with strength, flight, and transformation. Iron weapons, daggers, axes, and arrowheads, tools of defense, not just in life but in the world beyond. These items weren't ornamental excess. They were part of the soul's equipment, carefully selected, lovingly placed. To the Pazyryk, the body was a traveler. The tomb was a cart. The ice was not a prison but a waiting room for eternity. Preservation, accidental and intentional. Unlike the embalmers of Egypt or the monks of Palermo, the Pazyryk didn't preserve the dead on purpose. Their preservation was accidental, a product of climate, depth, and isolation. And yet, some signs suggest they understood the importance of maintaining the body's form. In several mummies, evidence of embalming techniques has been found. Removal of internal organs, filling of the cavity with moss, bark, or grass, possibly to prevent bloating. The bodies were wrapped in multiple layers: felt, wool, leather, all of which slowed decomposition. Even if they didn't intend to preserve the flesh forever, they clearly valued the integrity of the form at the time of burial. The body was not to be left bare, nor broken. It was to be clothed, positioned, and encased, ready for what came next. Echoes in the modern world. Today, the Pazyryk culture is no longer a mystery for archaeologists alone. Their legacy resonates with indigenous Altai people, many of whom claim cultural descent from these ancient steppe tribes. For them, the discovery of the tombs is not just scientific, it's personal. When archaeologists uncover a kurgan, local shamans often perform rituals to close the portal between worlds. Offerings are made, songs are sung, spirits are asked to rest. Some communities have asked that mummies be reburied or relocated to sacred ground. Others have welcomed the scientific study, seeing it as a form of validation for their ancestral stories. In either case, the message is clear. The dead are not gone. They are still present in land, blood, and memory. And so we stand again beneath the gray Siberian sky, on the edge of a burial mound where a tattooed warrior sleeps beside his horses. His skin is dry, his jaw still clenched, his arms marked with creatures that no longer roam. He does not speak, but he does endure. And in the enduring silence of this land, we hear a question rise like mist from the permafrost. Is death the final act of life, or is it simply the longest journey we prepare for but never fully understand? The wind over the Altai Mountains has not changed. It still runs low over the hills, stirring dry grass and sweeping snow across forgotten trails. Somewhere beneath that surface, buried deep in frozen silence, the Pazyryk dead continue to sleep in their wooden tombs wrapped in felt, guarded by horses, and preserved by the accidental mercy of ice. We've followed their discovery and their funerary customs. Now, in this final section, we reflect on what these mummies mean today, not only as archaeological phenomena, but as enduring questions. Their presence speaks not just of what the Pazyryk believed, but of what we believe about death, the body, remembrance, and the ethics of exposure. They are among the most intact people ever retrieved from the past. But to what end do we keep their bodies? And what truly is the legacy of those frozen in time? The archaeologist's dilemma: science versus sanctity. When Soviet archaeologists like Sergei Rudenko first unearthed the Pazyryk tombs in the 1920s and 1940s, they treated the finds as pure data insights into prehistory. The ice-preserved remains were considered triumphs of discovery, troves of anthropological and cultural significance. Their tattoos, their grave goods, even their intestinal contents were analyzed in laboratories across the Soviet Union. But in recent decades, the scientific narrative has been forced to share space with another, the narrative of cultural heritage and of living descendants. Local Altai peoples increasingly voice discomfort with the way the mummies have been handled. Some demand reburial, others call for restricted access, greater religious sensitivity, or a return of remains to their homeland from museums. What was once seen as a body of knowledge is now, quite literally, being reframed as a body with kin. Museums, faced with this evolving ethical landscape, have begun to reassess their practices. Some now consult with local communities before excavations. Others have withdrawn human remains from display. In a world more attuned to cultural rites, the question is no longer can we study the dead, but should we, and how? This shift marks a profound change in how we view preservation. No longer just a scientific act, it is now a cultural and moral dialogue. Living technologies, what the mummies still teach us. Despite the growing calls for restraint, the Pazyryk mummies have already given us an enormous amount of information insights that continue to reshape how we understand ancient life on the Eurasian steppe. Here are just a few of the lessons the ice has yielded. Diet and medicine. Analysis of stomach contents and teeth reveals that the Pazyryk consumed barley, millet, and dairy products. Some even ingested medicinal herbs, likely administered by shamans. Trade and influence. Woolen textiles found in tombs feature motifs and weaving techniques from Persia and China, evidence of a wide-ranging trade network, long before the Silk Road was formalized. Body modification. Tattoos, scarification, and evidence of trepanation, cranial surgery, show a complex relationship with the body. These were not cosmetic; many seem to mark status, tribe, or spiritual role. Clothing and craftsmanship. The level of detail in the clothing seams, fasteners, embroidery reveals a refined material culture. One woman's headdress included dyed feathers and gold-threaded fabric. Social stratification. The variation in burial richness and ritual points to a stratified society, likely with spiritual leaders, warriors, artisans, and servants all united in a shared cosmology of death and transition. Through these discoveries, the Pazyryk continue to teach us. But unlike museum exhibits that sit silently in glass cases, these mummies are dynamic in their impact, prompting new questions each year, not only about their world but about ours. The Ice Maiden Revisited. Few mummies have sparked more conversation than the so-called Ice Maiden. Since her discovery in 1993, she has become a symbol, a battleground, and a mystery. Her tattoos are studied in academic journals. Her likeness appears in textbooks, and her presence has drawn thousands to the Gornowaltyisk Museum, where she lies in a temperature-controlled chamber beneath frosted glass. But for many locals, her removal from her burial site remains controversial. Some say she was a Khan, a ruler, not a priestess. Others say she was a protector of the Altai, her spirit bound to the mountain that had cradled her for millennia. When her tomb was disturbed, some claim, the mountain shook in protest. These are not simply folklore retellings, they are contemporary beliefs. The Ice Maiden's meaning has grown since her death. She is now as much a part of modern Altai identity as she is of the ancient past. What archaeologists saw as a preserved corpse, others see as a living symbol. And this raises a critical truth. Preservation is not neutral. It changes how a culture is remembered and sometimes how it is reimagined. A different kind of immortality. For the Pazyryk, immortality was not based on conquest or writing. It was not a matter of temples or texts. It was tactile, carved into objects, stitched into clothing, inked into skin. Their eternity was not one of visibility, but of preparation. In a sense, the ice gave them something even their shamans couldn't have predicted: literal preservation across millennia. But immortality, as we understand it, often involves visibility. These mummies are now studied, photographed, discussed. Their images have been projected on screens in classrooms thousands of kilometers from their resting place. Is this the immortality they envisioned? Or is it something else, something unintended, perhaps unwanted? They remain, but they remain as part of our world now, reframed, repurposed, and continually reinterpreted. The quiet question of preservation. In the end, we must ask, why do we preserve? Is it for reverence, for curiosity, for control, for guilt? The Pazyryk did not expect to be remembered this way. They built no lasting monuments. They wrote no memoirs. They prepared their dead with care, but not for display. Their rituals were private, sacred, bound to a cosmology that we can only glimpse. And yet, through the accident of ice, they were given a second life. They have been seen perhaps more than any of their contemporaries, but they have also been removed from the rhythms they once knew. Preservation gives us access to the past, but it also gives the past a fragile new identity. In the case of the Pazyryk, the preservation is both a miracle and a puzzle. As you imagine the last breath of a Pazyryk elder, wrapped in wool and lowered into the earth with quiet songs and ritual gestures, remember, they did not expect to be found. Their world was one of cycles, not timelines, of spirits, not science. And now, in glass rooms and museum archives, they continue to rest not in darkness, but under a different kind of scrutiny. Their tattoos still speak, their garments still fold, their horses still wait. And we, the living, must wonder, do we preserve the dead to remember who they were, or to remember who we are? Story 4, Bones in the Wall, the ossuaries of medieval Europe. You descend a spiral staircase carved from worn limestone, your hand grazing a cold, damp rail. The air grows heavier as you descend, carrying with it the faint scent of dust, stone, and something older. Below, the light dims, not from the setting sun, but from the embrace of the underground. Then suddenly, you arrive and you see them. Thousands of bones. Skulls arranged in rows, femurs stacked like bricks, tibiae, vertebrae, pelvises sorted, catalogued, placed with care, layer upon layer. This is no ordinary tomb. This is an ossuary, a cathedral of remains, where the body has been transformed into architecture. You are no longer standing in a crypt. You are standing inside history's quietest archive, where human remains became both symbol and structure. In this story, we travel through the ossuaries of medieval Europe, not to thrill, not to shock, but to understand why entire walls were built from bones, why the dead were arranged like bricks, and why, in a time of spiritual anxiety and material shortage, the most practical solution to overcrowded cemeteries became a kind of sacred sculpture, an art of arrangement in the service of eternity. What is an ossuary? An ossuary is a place where bones, often many thousands of them, are stored, sometimes stacked in niches, sometimes arranged with precision and pattern. The word itself comes from the Latin ossuarium, meaning container of bones. But these were not merely mass graves. An ossuary is something different, something more deliberate. It is a repository, a curated space for remains that have already undergone initial burial. Typically, bodies were first buried in temporary graves. After a period of decomposition ranging from 5 to 10 years, the remains were exhumed, cleaned, and transferred to an ossuary. This practice served both symbolic and practical purposes. Symbolically, it reflected the medieval belief in the communal body of Christ. Just as the faithful gathered in life, so too would they gather in death. Practically, it addressed a growing crisis: overcrowded cemeteries in rapidly expanding urban centers, especially in times of plague, war, and famine. And so, from the 12th century onward, bone churches and ossuaries began to appear across Europe, particularly in France, Germany, Switzerland, Austria, and parts of Eastern Europe. Some were discreet, small charnel houses hidden beside parish churches. Others became grand monuments, chambers filled with thousands, even millions of bones. But all shared one quiet message: you are dust, and you will return to the community of dust. The medieval view of death. To understand ossuaries, one must first understand how medieval Europeans thought about death. Unlike our modern discomfort with the subject, medieval Christians lived in close proximity to it. Life was short, disease was rampant, warfare was frequent, few reached old age, and death came suddenly, often without warning. The Black Death alone killed between 30–60% of Europe's population in the 14th century. But death was not just an event. It was a moral test. One's fate in the afterlife depended not only on how one lived, but on how one died. A good death involved confession, the sacraments, the presence of clergy, and burial in consecrated ground. The bones of the faithful were considered sacred, awaiting resurrection at the end of time. They could not simply be discarded. They had to be preserved, protected, and placed with care. And so, as burial space grew scarce, churches sought new ways to respect the dead without losing room for the living. Enter the ossuary, a space both spiritual and efficient, reverent and architectural. The Paris Catacombs, bones beneath the Capitol. Among the most famous ossuaries in the world is the Catacombs of Paris, a vast underground network housing the remains of over 6 million people. Though created later than medieval ossuaries, mostly in the late 18th century, the Paris catacombs reflect the same logic taken to monumental extremes. Originally limestone quarries, these tunnels were repurposed when Paris's cemeteries became dangerously overcrowded, threatening health and sanitation. Starting in the 1780s, bones from cemeteries such as Les Innocents were exhumed and transported in wagons, often at night, and carefully stacked in underground galleries. Skulls were arranged in patterns, femurs in tight rows, creating entire walls of human remains. Some passages are adorned with crosses, inscriptions, or plaques with quotes about mortality. But despite its later construction, the catacombs inherited a medieval idea. The dead should be gathered together, not hidden. They should speak, not vanish. And in the stillness of those tunnels, they do. Sedlec Ossuary, the Bone Church of Bohemia. One of the most visually arresting ossuaries in Europe lies in the Czech Republic, in the small town of Kutná Hora. Inside the chapel of the Cemetery Church of All Saints at Sedlec, the bones of over 40,000 individuals have been transformed into elaborate decorations. Chandeliers made of vertebrae, pyramids of skulls, a coat of arms built from femurs and jawbones, even the signature of the 19th century craftsman František Rint spelled out in bone. But despite the Baroque flourishes, the purpose was not macabre. The Sedlec ossuary was built in response to centuries of burial demand, particularly after the Black Death, and the Hussite Wars filled the cemetery far beyond capacity. Instead of burying or burning the bones, the monks chose to display them to show that even in death, the body could participate in sacred space. Here the bones are not garbage, they are decoration, not as vanity but as memory. The logic of arrangement. One might assume that bones in an ossuary were dumped haphazardly, a chaotic pile of the anonymous dead, but this was rarely the case. In most ossuaries, bones are sorted by type: skulls in one section, femurs in another. Long bones were stacked like timber. Skulls, treated with more reverence, were often placed at eye level or arranged in crosses or rows. Why such careful sorting? Partly for efficiency. Long bones stacked neatly, creating stable walls, but also for symbolism. The skull, as the seat of the face, was seen as the most personal and spiritually resonant part of the body. To display it was to preserve identity, even if that identity was anonymous. This organization reflected a belief in order even in death. Just as monasteries arranged daily life into liturgy, ossuaries arranged death into geometry. Death was not chaos, it was structure, a continuation of sacred order. The silent congregation. There is something deeply communal about an ossuary. It is not a private grave, not a mausoleum for the elite. It is a place where the bones of peasants, monks, children, merchants, and soldiers lie side by side indistinguishable. In ossuaries, social distinction ends. Flesh has fallen away. Rank is erased. Here, the powerful lie cheek to jowl with the poor. The anonymous are given a place beside the remembered. In a society of rigid hierarchy, the ossuary was a rare moment of equality. Perhaps that is why they continue to speak to us not in fear, but in stillness, not in spectacle, but in structure. The bones say nothing, and yet they remind us that we are all bound by the same future. And so, as you rise again from the quiet of the ossuary, your footsteps, muffled by centuries of death, you might ask, is this what it means to be remembered? not as a name carved in stone, but as one of many, folded gently into the architecture of the sacred. Once again you return beneath the earth. The stone walls seem closer now, the silence heavier. Bones press in from every side, not with menace but with quiet insistence. Here, the dead have been arranged not only to conserve space but to serve a purpose. They are not simply stored, they are presented, and behind every arrangement is a belief. In this second section, we look beyond the surface of the ossuaries, not just how they were built, but what they meant, who tended to them, what rituals surrounded their use, and how did the living relate to these rooms of the dead. This is not a story of horror. It is a story of care, of repetition, and of what it means to honor life by dignifying its end. Who built the ossuaries? The labor behind Europe's ossuaries is largely anonymous. Few names are recorded, few sculptors remembered. But the caretakers were often monks, lay brothers, or gravediggers attached to cathedrals or parish churches. Their work was quiet, repetitive, and deeply devotional. When remains were exhumed from cemeteries, often because space was needed for new burials, bones were collected with care. Fleshless, weathered, sometimes fragmented, they were washed, sometimes blessed, and transported to the ossuary. The arrangement of bones was not arbitrary. In places like the Sedlec Ossuary or the Cape Laduz Ossos, Chapel of Bones, in Evora, Portugal, there is clear evidence of planning. Bones were sorted by type, cleaned, and often whitened with lime or treated with ash. The result was not only hygienic but symbolic. The anonymous dead became part of a visible, ordered whole. In this, the caretakers practiced a humble artistry, one not aimed at fame, but at faith. They worked in silence, aligning tibias, stacking skulls, measuring walls not in meters but in remains. The process may have taken weeks or months. There was no rush. After all, the occupants were not going anywhere. The liturgical calendar of the dead. Ossuaries were not forgotten corners of churches. Many were integrated into the rhythms of monastic life. Specific days, especially All Saints' Day, November 1, and All Souls' Day, November 2, were devoted to the remembrance of the dead. Masses were said in their honor. Processions wound through the crypts. Incense was burned. Psalms were chanted. The presence of bones didn't disrupt worship, it deepened it. Some ossuaries had altars. Some featured murals depicting the danse macabre, a medieval motif showing skeletons dancing with kings, bishops, and peasants alike. These paintings were not meant to frighten. They were meant to instruct. Death is universal, impartial, and ever-present. In some monasteries, monks prayed the office of the dead among the bones, chanting in the presence of those they once called brothers. The ossuary was not separate from the sacred. It was part of it. The bones were not reminders of decay, but of resurrection. The Cape Laduz Ossos, we bones that here are await yours. In the Portuguese city of Evora, inside the Church of St. Francis, is one of Europe's most well-known ossuaries, the Chapel of Bones, Cape Laduz Ossos. Built in the 16th century by a Franciscan friar, it was designed as a direct response to the vanities of earthly life. The walls are lined with an estimated 5,000 human skulls, femurs, and pelvises layered with mortar and carefully arranged. In niches above the altar, 2 desiccated corpses hang from chains, still clothed. Their identities are unknown. Above the entrance is a chilling but contemplative inscription. Nas ossos que aqui estamos, pelos vossos esperamos. We bones that here are await yours. It is not a threat, it is an invitation. To consider that life is brief, that death is certain, that what matters is not how we die, but how we live in full view of death's inevitability. Aesthetic or theology. Visitors to ossuaries often ask, why make it beautiful? Why chandeliers of skulls, decorative arches of vertebrae, symmetrical patterns of bones? The answer lies not in decoration for its own sake, but in medieval aesthetics which understood beauty as a form of order. In this view, death was not inherently ugly. Disruption, disorder, and moral decay were ugly, but death itself was natural, part of the divine order. By arranging bones into patterns, monks and caretakers were not hiding death, they were redeeming it. Beauty was a way to express the belief that death had a place in God's plan, that even the most broken bones belonged to a higher design. And this aesthetic helped reinforce theology, that the body, though decayed, retained spiritual significance. Even when reduced to fragments, the human form pointed to resurrection, to continuity, to the great gathering of all things at the end of time. Anonymous but not forgotten. The vast majority of bones in ossuaries are unnamed. There are no inscriptions, no plaques, no genealogies. The identity of the dead was often lost when graves were emptied decades after burial, but that did not mean they were unloved. The ossuary was, in many ways, a redemocratization of memory. While aristocrats and clergy might have elaborate tombs above ground, the ossuary brought all people, rich and poor, into the same visual and spiritual space. One skull looks much like another. One femur offers no rank. Here, anonymity became a form of solidarity. The names were forgotten, but the fact of their being was not. And in this quiet crowd of the nameless, the living were reminded that their lives, too, would end not in erasure, but in community. Female bones, children's bones. In most ossuaries, the bones of women and children are present alongside those of men, though they are rarely marked as such. Some ossuaries were attached to hospitals, where patients who died without family were buried and later exhumed. Others were tied to convents or parishes, serving entire communities. In Sedlec and Evora, skeletal remains of children are sometimes identifiable by size or condition. Their inclusion reminds us that death did not wait for old age. Infants, mothers, young adults all were swept up by plague, war, or famine. Their bones are smaller, sometimes more fragile, but they too were arranged with care. In a world where names faded quickly, the ossuary became a kind of second family, a final home for those who died alone. Ossuaries and the modern gaze. Today, ossuaries occupy a strange place in the modern imagination. They are often described as creepy, morbid, or gothic, even though their original builders would not have used such terms. Tourists file through in silence, sometimes reverent, sometimes disturbed. Some take photos, others leave in tears. But for all our discomfort, we are drawn to them, because ossuaries force us to ask questions we normally avoid. What happens when the name is forgotten, but the body remains? Is being remembered as a bone better than not being remembered at all? And if thousands are preserved in anonymity, how do we measure a meaningful life? You return again to the surface, stepping into the daylight after hours in the ossuary. The brightness feels foreign. The world outside bustles, alive with chatter and movement. But somewhere below, thousands of bones remain in stillness, not buried, not hidden but visible. A shared reminder, waiting without impatience. They are not asking for remembrance. They are reminding you that you, too, will one day be reduced to what is essential. There is something deeply humbling about bones. Not the horror of them, not fear or revulsion, but the simplicity. Bone is what remains when everything else falls away. No more skin, no more names, no more voice. Only the structure that once carried a life. And in the ossuaries of medieval Europe, bones were not only stored, they were arranged, made into form, into function, into memory. They became part of walls, arches, crosses, and inscriptions. And in this final section, we examine what these silent structures ultimately mean, not just in the past, but in the present. Because ossuaries are not just about death, they are about impermanence and what we choose to do with it. Bones as architecture. You can run your fingers along the surface of a wall in an ossuary and feel the subtle curve of a femur, the fragile bowl of a cranium. It's a wall, yes, but it's also a congregation. Unlike brick or stone, these materials were never meant to last in this way. And yet, some of these walls have stood for centuries, bound with lime or clay, supported by the pressure of symmetry and care. But here's the paradox. Ossuaries are structures built from what decomposes. This makes them a kind of anti-monument, a place that both resists time and reminds us that nothing resists forever. Over time, bones crack, mortar weakens, dust settles. Even the most carefully stacked skull may collapse, pulled down by moisture or gravity or simply age. Many ossuaries require continual maintenance to prevent decay from claiming the dead a second time. And so we are forced to ask, what does it mean to build permanence from impermanence? The forgotten, the discovered. Ossuaries often contain tens of thousands of individuals, and while we may marvel at the scale, the truth is that nearly all of these people are forgotten. Their names were never recorded. Their graves were temporary. Their final place is collective. But sometimes someone is found. A scrap of cloth, a burial token, a faint carving on a skull just enough to trace a path back to identity. A nun, perhaps, a nobleman, a child who died in a noted plague year. These discoveries are rare but powerful. They are reminders that behind each bone is a story that was once whole. Modern archaeologists and osteologists sometimes identify disease, trauma, or diet through bone analysis. They find signs of malnutrition, healed fractures, arthritis. And in these small discoveries, a fuller picture emerges not just of individuals, but of life in medieval Europe. The ossuary becomes a document not only of death, but of how people lived, suffered, healed, and aged. And sometimes, even in anonymity, we see humanity clearly. Memento mori in the modern mind. In medieval Europe, memento mori was a common theme, remember you must die. It was painted in books, carved into walls, written into sermons. Death was not taboo, it was a mirror. Ossuaries embodied this mindset. They were not places of fear, but of confrontation. To walk through a room of bones was not to indulge in morbidity, it was to reflect. Today we struggle with that. Death is often hidden, sanitized in hospitals, delayed by medicine, euphemized in language. We say passed away instead of died. We embalm, cremate, and disperse. Ossuaries interrupt that. They force us to look, quietly and calmly, at what we become. They do not judge, they do not lecture, but their silence is louder than words. They say, "This too is you." And perhaps that is why so many people still visit ossuaries, not to be shocked, but to be grounded. Between display and devotion. Modern visitors to ossuaries often struggle with how to respond. Should one be reverent, curious, silent? Can you photograph bones? Can you take a guided tour? Buy a postcard? Some ossuaries have leaned into their tourist appeal. Gift shops sell magnets and replicas. Some are lit dramatically. Others are protected behind glass. And while none of this is inherently disrespectful, it does mark a change. In their original form, ossuaries were not museums. They were liturgical spaces. Their builders were not showcasing death, they were integrating it into the rhythm of spiritual life. As ossuaries transition into heritage sites, the risk is that they lose their meaning not through erosion of stone, but erosion of context. Without the theology that built them, without the ritual that maintained them, they can become spectacle. And so, modern caretakers are faced with a delicate task. How do you preserve a sacred silence in a world that rarely pauses? The ethics of bone. Increasingly, questions arise about how to treat human remains. Is it ethical to keep bones on display? Should ossuaries be closed to tourists? Should the bones be reburied? Some argue that modern standards of consent and dignity should be retroactively applied. that bones, even if ancient and anonymous, deserve privacy. Others respond that these bones were arranged by communities for specific purposes, that reburial now would erase history and sever a tradition of remembrance. There is no simple answer, but the question itself is worth sitting with. Because to care for bones is not just to care for the past, it's to wrestle with what it means to remember without possession, to preserve without exploitation. The end of the ossuary. Few new ossuaries have been built in recent centuries. As burial practices have changed, the need for such spaces has diminished. Cremation is increasingly common. Urban planning has moved burials to the outskirts of cities, and theological shifts have reoriented ideas about the body. But ossuaries have not disappeared. They remain, quietly enduring beneath cathedrals, behind convents, beneath cobbled streets. Some crumble, some are restored, others are rediscovered, forgotten chambers opened during renovations or excavations. And in each the same message remains. The human body is temporary, but remembrance, even in its most basic form, a bone, a shape, a skull, can persist far longer than we expect. A final silence. You leave the ossuary for the last time, your footsteps echoing less now. The air outside is warmer, noisier, sharper, but something stays with you. Not a face, not a name. Just the pattern of bones, the structure of memory, the quiet understanding that one day you too will be reduced, not necessarily to a wall or a shrine, but to something less than flesh and more than forgotten. Because maybe that's what ossuaries really offer: not permanence, not glory, but peace with impermanence. A space where the dead are not hidden, but gathered. Where history is not told in dates, but in density. Where death is not feared, but folded into the architecture of life. And so the final question remains, nestled quietly between stacked skulls and crossed femurs. Is it possible that the most enduring monuments are not made of stone, but of those who once lived, now resting together in silence? Story 5. A Pilgrim's Journey, Saint Relics in the Age of Faith. You are walking a narrow road in 12th century France. The ground is uneven. The dust clings to your sandals. Ahead lies a modest chapel, its stone walls soot-darkened by candle smoke and centuries of quiet devotion. Inside, behind an iron grate, lies a bone, a femur perhaps, or a fragment of skull resting on crimson velvet, adorned with gold leaf and glass. The faithful kneel before it, whispering prayers, lighting candles, tracing signs of the cross. They have come not just to see it, but to be changed by it. This is not a museum, it is a shrine. And the bone, it is believed to be part of a saint, an individual whose holiness, in life and death, radiates beyond time. In this story, we follow the journey of relics, how they were preserved, enshrined, protected, stolen, faked, and adored. We explore how bits of bone and blood became instruments of healing, identity, and power, and how the faithful once mapped the sacred not in scripture alone, but in the scattered remains of the holy. What are relics? In Christian tradition, especially during the medieval period, relics are the physical remains of saints, or objects associated with Christ, Mary, or the apostles. These may include first-class relics, actual body parts, bones, hair, blood, teeth, sometimes entire corpses. Second-class relics, items used by the saint: robes, sandals, crucifixes, walking staffs. Third-class relics, objects like cloth that have touched a first or second-class relic, often distributed to pilgrims in mass quantities. Relics were not seen as symbols, they were seen as extensions of the sacred. A fragment of bone did not just represent the saint, it was, in a sense, the saint, active, listening, present. This belief was rooted in Christian theology, the idea that the body, even in death, retained spiritual value. Since saints were believed to be especially close to God, their remains became conduits for miracles, healing, and divine protection. To touch a relic was to be touched by grace. The rise of the pilgrimage economy. From the 4th century onward, the cult of saints and the veneration of their relics grew steadily. By the High Middle Ages, it had become a foundational part of Christian life. Pilgrims traveled across Europe on foot, horseback, or by boat, often for months or years to visit shrines. Some were driven by penance, others by illness, others by devotion. They sought blessings, miracles, or simply the assurance of proximity to holiness. Churches that held important relics became major destinations. Santiago de Compostela in Spain, where the remains of St. James were believed to lie. Canterbury Cathedral in England, home to the bloodied garments of Thomas Becket. Cologne Cathedral in Germany, which claimed the skulls of the three magi. Rome, of course, with its multitude of saintly remains and objects of passion. And everywhere in between, thousands of smaller churches held single bones, teeth, or vials of blood, each one its own spiritual epicenter. Relics shaped the geography of faith. They turned roads into pilgrim routes, cities into sacred waypoints, and tiny chapels into miracles in waiting. How were relics preserved? Relics required careful handling, both physically and theologically. Bones and body parts were usually kept in reliquaries containers made of wood, silver, gold, or ivory. These containers varied in form and grandeur. Some were shaped like body parts: a golden arm to house a saint's humerus, a silver foot for a toe bone. Others took the form of crosses, monstrances, or chests, often covered in gems and inscribed with Latin verses. Entire altars might be built to hold a single relic, sealed beneath stone slabs, visible through small windows. Preservation wasn't always perfect. In humid climates, relics could decay, but even decayed or fragmentary remains retained their value. If anything, scarcity increased sanctity. In some monasteries, monks would catalog relics in Latin inventories, complete with claims of origin, date of acquisition, and miracles associated with them. In others, relics were kept hidden, only brought out on feast days or during times of plague and famine. The material fragility of relics only increased their aura. They were flesh made precious not because they lasted, but because they pointed beyond decay. Miracles and testimonies. Relics were rarely inert. They were believed to act. Stories circulated written in hagiographies and painted on chapel walls of relics that cured blindness, lameness, or epilepsy, ended droughts or plagues, defended towns from invaders, wept blood, reanimated the dead, if only briefly. The faithful would touch relics with cloths, water, or jewelry, hoping to transfer some measure of sanctity. Pilgrims often carried these contact relics home or wore them as protective amulets. Some shrines kept books of miracles, where clergy recorded testimonials. A woman barren for 10 years conceived after kneeling before the skull of Saint Genevieve. A knight recovered from fever after placing his sword upon the shinbone of Saint Martin. These records were not always examined with skepticism. Faith validated the claim. And so, the line between relic and result remained blessedly blurry. Theft, trade, and the black market of holiness. But not all relics stayed where they were placed. From the 8th century onward, the value of relics created a market of sanctity complete with forgeries, thefts, and rivalries between churches. Relic theft, called furta sacra, was sometimes considered pious if the new location was more suitable or holy. Monasteries might steal a saint's finger from another town, claiming divine instruction. Forging relics became a widespread practice. The same saint might have 3 skulls and 20 fingers in different cities. Even fragments of the true cross were so numerous that Erasmus quipped they could build a fleet of ships. Relics were gifted between rulers, used to forge alliances or demonstrate loyalty to Rome. The Crusades opened up vast opportunities for acquiring Eastern relics, many of them, looted from Constantinople or Holy Land churches. The Church attempted regulation, organizing relic veneration at councils, requiring authentication, issuing bulls, but the trade remained fluid, often decentralized, and deeply popular. In this world, bones were currency not in gold but in grace. The role of the pilgrim. Pilgrims were not passive observers. They were active participants in the world of relics. Traveling long distances, often on foot, pilgrims endured hardship to reach the shrines. They carried staffs, badges, and letters of recommendation. Some walked in chains, others in silence. Once at a shrine, pilgrims might sleep near the relic, drink water touched to it, or tie personal items to the reliquary. Some paid fees, others gave what they had. In return, they received tokens, lead badges shaped like saints, ampullae of holy oil, or strips of cloth. These items returned home with them, sometimes placed over sick beds or buried with the owner. In this way, relics radiated outwards, creating a spiritual web across medieval Europe, connecting farmer and king, city and hamlet, through shared belief in the potency of the blessed dead. And so you imagine once more that solitary chapel on the hill. The femur lies beneath glass, still, gray, silent. Around it flicker candles, breathing wax and smoke into the stale air. You are not alone. Others kneel nearby, peasants, priests, travelers, lepers. Some cry, others simply sit. None speak. They do not need to. The relic speaks for them, not in words but in presence. And as you stand, the question lingers. Is the power in the bone itself, or in the belief we have placed inside it? The church is full, packed to its cold stone walls with peasants, nobility, and clergy alike. The air hangs heavy with incense. A procession moves slowly toward the altar, led not by a bishop or king but by a golden box. Inside, behind crystal and gold, rests a single bone, a fragment of a saint's arm or a piece of skull believed to be centuries old. It's carried high, veiled by silk, kissed by the faithful as it passes. This is more than veneration. It is theater, it is liturgy, it is politics. Because in medieval Europe, relics did not just shape the private lives of pilgrims. They shaped entire societies, binding kingdoms to the sacred, cities to saints, and rulers to divine favor. They were carried into battle, installed in cathedrals, and invoked in courts of law. In this section, we explore how relics became instruments of power, how their movement defined political landscapes, and how the lines between sacred devotion and strategic advantage blurred, sometimes completely. Relics and royal authority. From the early Middle Ages onward, rulers recognized the power of possessing relics. To house a significant saint's remains was to claim access to divine intercession, legitimacy, and popular reverence. Charlemagne, king of the Franks and Holy Roman Emperor, collected relics, zealously transporting them across Europe and distributing them to favored churches. By doing so, he positioned himself as a protector and benefactor of the sacred. French kings at Sainte-Chapelle in Paris enshrined what they claimed were relics of Christ's Passion, the crown of thorns, pieces of the true cross, and the Holy Lance. The display of these relics reinforced their status as God's chosen monarchs. In England, Edward the Confessor's shrine at Westminster Abbey became both a royal tomb and a relic site. Later kings were crowned in his shadow, wrapped in his spiritual protection. Royal processions often featured relics. Kings carried them during coronations, wars, and plagues. Possessing a powerful relic could legitimize a weak claim to the throne or delegitimize a rival. In this sense, relics became instruments of sovereignty not because they ruled, but because they sanctified rule. Cities built around bones. Relics didn't just influence monarchs, they reshaped cities. Towns that acquired significant relics became pilgrimage centers. Pilgrims brought not only devotion but economic life, paying for lodging, candles, food, and souvenirs. A single tooth or rib, if believed authentic, could elevate a sleepy hamlet into a bustling spiritual destination. Santiago de Compostela in Galicia, Spain, grew from a small village to a major Christian capital because of its shrine to St. James. By the 12th century, it rivaled Rome and Jerusalem as a pilgrimage site. Padua in northern Italy became synonymous with St. Anthony after his remains were enshrined there. His tongue, claimed to have remained incorrupt, was displayed in a reliquary and still draws crowds today. Venice famously acquired the remains of St. Mark from Alexandria in the 9th century, allegedly smuggled under layers of pork to avoid detection by Muslim guards. St. Mark's Basilica, built to house him, became the centerpiece of Venetian identity. In each case, the relic was not merely a religious object, it was a civic treasure, protected, venerated, and embedded in local pride. To lose a relic was a calamity. To gain one was a miracle. Translations, the holy on the move. The movement of relics called translations was often ceremonial and strategic. Relics were carried in elaborate processions, welcomed with feasts, bells, and hymns. Their arrival marked the spiritual elevation of a community. But not all translations were peaceful. Some were acts of conquest or appropriation. In 1204, during the Fourth Crusade, Latin crusaders sacked Constantinople and carried off a staggering number of relics including bones of apostles, saints, and objects from the Passion. These were distributed to churches across Western Europe. Monasteries competed for relics. In some cases, monks from one abbey would steal a rival's relics under the cover of night, believing that divine will justify the theft. One such tale involves the monks of Conques in southern France, who stole the remains of Saint Foy from Agen. Legend claims she allowed herself to be taken appearing in dreams to guide the theft. Such stories were not considered scandalous. They were proof that saints acted with intention even in death. Miraculous relics and the spectacle of display. Relics were not simply locked away. They were put on display, especially during times of crisis. During droughts, famine, or plague, relics were carried in public processions. Their exposure was thought to invoke divine mercy. Skulls were kissed, bones paraded through villages, and cloths pressed to reliquaries, creating contact relics to be sent home. Churches crafted increasingly elaborate reliquaries, often shaped like arms, feet, or heads, so that the relic could be seen and venerated. These were often made of silver or gold, encrusted with jewels. But the value lay not in the container, it lay in the belief that inside was a vessel of sanctity. Pilgrims wept at the sight of these relics. Some claimed instant healing. Others left offerings, coins, candles, ex-votos, votive offerings, and written petitions. This spectacle was not manipulation. It was theater of the sacred, a public expression of collective hope. In an age with no antibiotics, no insurance, no modern medicine, a bone behind glass might be the closest thing to salvation. The Church's attempt at control. As relic veneration grew, so did concerns over authenticity and abuse. By the 12th and 13th centuries, the Catholic Church began regulating the relic trade. Popes issued decrees limiting the movement of bodies. Bishops were instructed to authenticate relics before public veneration. Canon law was updated to discourage fraud. The Fourth Lateran Council, 1215, required papal approval before relics could be displayed or sold. And yet, despite these efforts, forgeries persisted. Markets for relics thrived in cities like Rome and Venice. Some vendors sold bones of unknown origin as saintly remains. Others dipped cloth into tombs, then sold them as miraculous cures. Even today, many relics cannot be verified. DNA testing is rare. Provenance is unclear. But for the faithful, certainty was never the point. Faith more than evidence animated the bone. Relics in conflict and reformation. By the late Middle Ages, Relics had become so entwined with power that they were swept up in religious conflict. During the Protestant Reformation, reformers like Martin Luther denounced relic veneration as idolatry and superstition. Churches were ransacked, bones destroyed, reliquaries melted down for gold. Thousands of relics were lost forever. In England, under Henry VIII, shrines were dissolved. The shrine of St. Thomas Becket at Canterbury was torn down. His bones were burned. The church shifted toward a focus on scripture and away from tangible mediators of holiness. But relics never truly disappeared. In Catholic regions, they remained central to devotion. In Counter-Reformation Europe, relics were showcased with renewed vigor, used to assert Catholic identity and divine favor in the face of Protestant critique. And even in modern times, relics are still venerated, carried in processions, displayed in cathedrals, touched by the devout. The body, however fragmented, still speaks. So now you picture again the dusty pilgrim, finally arriving after weeks of travel. He enters the church quietly, eyes adjusting to candlelight. Before him rests the relic, small, unassuming, ancient. He kneels, not to the bone but to what it signifies: closeness, hope, healing. And as he touches the hem of the reliquary, he is not thinking of authenticity or politics. He is thinking of his child who is ill, of his guilt which he cannot carry, of the journey long and lonely, of the story he was told that this saint once healed a man just like him. And in that moment, belief becomes contact. The bone does not speak, but the silence is filled with prayer. The pilgrim has returned home. His feet are blistered. His small satchel carries a badge from the shrine, a scrap of cloth pressed to a reliquary, and most importantly, a story. He has touched a bone, not just any bone, but a sacred one. His wife listens. His neighbors gather. And in the retelling, the journey becomes a kind of relic itself, a story passed from voice to voice, long after the original touch has faded. In this final section, we follow what happened to relics as Europe changed, how these bones endured through skepticism, war, and time. We look at how their meanings evolved, how some were lost or hidden, and how, even now, fragments of saints continue to move through the world. Because relics were never just historical, they were always personal. And for many, they still are. The Reformation and the breaking of bones. The 16th century brought a profound rupture in European religious life. As Protestant reformers challenged the authority of the Catholic Church, relics became one of the first targets. Martin Luther, a former monk, denounced the cult of relics as superstition and exploitation. In his writings, he attacked the idea that bones could mediate salvation, calling many venerated remains bones of dead dogs and cats. He mocked the proliferation of relics, pointing to multiple heads of John the Baptist and enough splinters of the true cross to build a ship. The response was not limited to theology, it was physical. In England, under Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries, shrines were stripped of relics. The shrine of St. Thomas Becket at Canterbury, once one of Europe's most visited, was destroyed. His bones were removed and burned. In Germany, Switzerland, and Scandinavia, relics were pulled from altars, smashed, thrown into rivers, or buried in secret by devout Catholics trying to protect them. In Geneva, under Calvinist reforms, relics were condemned as idolatrous objects. Churches were whitewashed, processions banned, and the veneration of saints discouraged entirely. This was not just iconoclasm. It was a remapping of sacred geography. Towns that once pulsed with pilgrimage became silent. Shrines were emptied. Bones disappeared. For the reformers, it was a liberation from corruption, from false promises, from superstition. But for many, it was also a loss, a rupture in the link between heaven and earth. Counter-Reformation, bones reclaimed. The Catholic Church responded to the Protestant challenge with a renewed focus on relics. The Council of Trent, 1545–1563, reaffirmed the veneration of saints and relics, declaring that the holy bodies of holy martyrs are to be venerated by the faithful. In this Counter-Reformation, relics became tools of resilience and resistance. Churches and convents were rebuilt or restored, their relics rehoused in ornate Baroque reliquaries, glass-fronted, gilded, and radiant. In newly colonized regions like the Americas and Asia, Catholic missionaries carried relics as symbols of divine presence. Some churches in Mexico, Peru, and the Philippines still enshrine bones of European saints. In Catholic territories, new shrines arose. Bodies of saints were exhumed, authenticated, and placed on altars. Some were even displayed in full, dressed in lace, jewels, and brocade, their faces covered with wax masks. In this way, the Church reasserted the place of the body, whole or partial, as a site of holiness. The bones had not been silenced. They were, in some cases, louder than ever. Science and skepticism. As Europe entered the Enlightenment, a new challenge arose, not religious, but rational. The rise of science brought new scrutiny to the relics that filled cathedrals and chapels. Anatomists began to question the authenticity of remains. Could a bone really belong to a saint from the 3rd century if it bore signs of modern disease? Historians compared inventories and found contradictions. Too many relics of one saint, unclear provenance for another. Some skeptics saw relics as medieval frauds, products of credulity or economic exploitation. Museums, emerging in the 18th and 19th centuries, sometimes acquired relics not as devotional objects but as cultural artifacts. Behind glass, the relics were recontextualized, no longer sacred but historical. Still, many churches continued to venerate them. The faithful did not need verification. The bone, touched in prayer, remained powerful not because it was proven, but because it was believed. And perhaps that belief was a different kind of truth. Hidden and found, relics in the modern world. Even today, relics continue to appear in unexpected places. In 2010, restoration workers at St. Peter's Basilica in Rome uncovered a forgotten reliquary containing what is believed to be bone fragments of St. Peter himself. In France, bones of St. Mary Magdalene, long housed at Vézelay, continue to attract pilgrims despite centuries of disputes over their authenticity. In Italy, the body of St. Catherine of Bologna, seated upright in a glass case, still draws visitors to her convent, her skin darkened but her presence serene. There are also stories of bones hidden during war. During the French Revolution, as churches were desecrated, some priests and laypeople buried relics in wine cellars and gardens, later digging them up and returning them to altars when the turmoil passed. In World War II, relics from Cologne and other German churches were quietly removed and stored in mines or monasteries to protect them from bombing. The sacred, it seems, is never far from the fragile. The contemporary relic, still carried, still prayed over. Relics are not just medieval remnants, they are still part of living Catholic practice. The Vatican maintains a relic office, which authenticates and distributes relics to churches worldwide. Each is sealed with wax and accompanied by a certificate. Pilgrims today can still visit. The body of St. Pio of Pietrelcina, Padre Pio, in southern Italy. The incorrupt tongue of St. Anthony of Padua. The blood of St. Januarius in Naples, which is said to liquefy annually. Popes have carried relics in global processions. In 2019, the Vatican even returned relics of St. Peter to the Orthodox Church, an act of ecumenical goodwill. Relics are also present in times of crisis. During the COVID-19 pandemic, relics were brought to hospitals. Images of saints' bones, carried by masked clergy, were broadcast online, ancient bodies entering digital space. In this, the very old met the very new. Final thoughts: the body as memory. So what do we make of it all? The fragment of bone, the drop of blood, the lock of hair in a silver locket. These are not magic, nor are they merely artifacts. They are memory made physical, a way of keeping presence when absence is inevitable. For the faithful, relics remain a channel, not to worship the dead, but to feel the nearness of those who once lived with extraordinary grace. The relic is not just what remains, it is what remains meaningful. And in a world of uncertainty, these bones have continued to hold meaning far longer than anyone expected. So you return one last time to the shrine. The candles burn low now. The church is nearly empty, but the reliquary is still there. You approach not as a pilgrim or skeptic, but simply as someone with questions. The bone is silent, but so are the best listeners. And perhaps the real miracle is this: that even now, a fragment of a saint's body can speak not in miracles or fire, but in the quiet recognition that we, too, are part of something that will remain long after we are gone. Story 6, Wrapped in Rites, Mummification in the Chinchorro Culture. Before Egypt raised pyramids. Before linen was wrapped around the corpses of kings. Before embalming fluid flowed beneath the Nile's horizon. There was the desert, and in it there were mummies. But not in Egypt. Long before the Egyptians formalized mummification rituals, a small coastal people along the Atacama Desert, now northern Chile and southern Peru, were preserving their dead with an attention, artistry, and tenderness that would predate pharaohs by nearly 2 millennia. These were the Chinchorro. And this is their story. In this first section, we explore how the Chinchorro turned the desert's natural preservation into a sacred craft. Through the lens of the world's earliest artificial mummification, we step into a time before history had begun recording itself, when the line between life and death was porous, and the dead still lived in the community, transformed by the patient hands of the living. A culture at the edge of the world. The Chinchorro people lived along the arid coastline of the Atacama Desert, one of the driest places on Earth. Sandwiched between the Andes Mountains and the Pacific Ocean, the land receives virtually no rainfall. Vegetation is sparse, and yet the sea is rich. For the Chinchorro, the sea provided everything: fish, shellfish, birds, seals. Their diet was protein-rich. They fished with nets, harpoons, and hooks fashioned from cactus spines and copper. They gathered seaweed, collected eggs, and traded inland for fruit and plant products. But what sets the Chinchorro apart isn't just how they lived, it's how they honored the dead. Between 5000 and 2000 BCE, the Chinchorro developed what is now considered the oldest known practice of artificial mummification in the world. They mummified their dead long before the Egyptians ever thought to do the same. And yet they left no written language, no monumental architecture, only the preserved bodies scattered beneath the sand. Natural origins: the desert as a preserver. The Chinchorro lived in a landscape uniquely suited to preservation. The Atacama Desert, with its extreme aridity and salty soils, naturally desiccated bodies. A person buried in the sand, wrapped in reed mats or left uncovered, could dry out before decomposition had a chance to begin. This natural mummification is believed to have inspired the Chinchorro's artificial methods. Perhaps a body was found perfectly preserved, skin leathery, hair still intact, features unmistakable even in death. It must have felt like magic, a body returned from time. The Chinchorro, instead of fearing this, may have embraced it. Over time, they began to intervene in the process, not merely leaving the bodies to dry, but preparing them, reshaping them, adorning them. Preservation became participation. The Black Mummies, art of the afterlife. The oldest mummification technique developed by the Chinchorro is known as the Black Mummy style. It appeared around 5000 BCE. The process was elaborate, complex, even by modern standards. Disassembly, The body was carefully taken apart, skin was removed, organs were extracted, even the muscles were often separated from the bones. Reconstruction. The skeleton was reinforced with sticks and reeds. The skull might be filled with ash or clay. Joints were bound with fiber. Reapplication. The skin, sometimes from the same person, sometimes from another, was refitted over the frame. In some cases, clay masks or wigs of human hair were added. Coloration. The entire body was then coated in a thick layer of black manganese paste, giving the mummies their name. The result was both haunting and beautiful bodies transformed into sacred objects, neither simply dead nor fully alive, a liminal state. And these were not kings, not elites. These were ordinary people, fishermen, women, even infants. Egalitarian death. Everyone was mummified. One of the most remarkable aspects of Chinchorro mummification is its inclusivity. In Egyptian culture, mummification was reserved for the elite. For the Chinchorro, the opposite seems to be true. Children and infants were often mummified with more care than adults. Archaeologists have uncovered more mummified infants than any other demographic. There is no evidence of social hierarchy in burial practices, no lavish tombs or signs of wealth. This suggests that the Chinchorro viewed all human life as sacred. A baby who died too soon might still be tended, decorated, and preserved for years, carried, displayed, or even kept within the living household. For the Chinchorro, the dead did not depart. They were integrated into community life. Mummification wasn't an end, it was a transition. Red mummies and the evolution of technique. Over the millennia, Chinchorro mummification practices changed. By around 2500 BCE, a new style emerged, the red mummy. Instead of full disassembly, the body was left more intact. The skull was often removed, cleaned, and reattached after being filled with straw or ash. The skin was painted red using iron-rich ochre. Facial features were reconstructed with clay. Eyes and mouths were accentuated with fine detail. Later still came the mud-coated mummies' bodies covered in a thick paste of clay and ash, sometimes without internal removal. These were simpler, suggesting either a shift in ideology or a decline in technical skill. But across all styles, the theme remains the preservation of identity. The dead were not faceless corpses. They were remembered, recognized, restored. Ritual or resurrection. Why did the Chinchorro preserve their dead so diligently? No written records remain. No inscriptions explain their intent, but archaeologists and anthropologists propose several theories. Ancestor worship. Mummies may have served as intermediaries between the living and the spirit world, consulted during rituals or carried during seasonal ceremonies. Emotional grief. The mummification of children, in particular, suggests a deep desire to keep the dead close. Perhaps this was a way to cope with high infant mortality. Symbolic transformation. The process itself, dismantling, rebuilding, painting, may have symbolized spiritual rebirth, a new identity in death. Whatever the reason, it is clear the Chinchorro did not treat death as final. Mummification was not about hiding the body. It was about making it present, even more vivid than before. Discovery in the modern era. The first Chinchorro mummies were discovered in the early 20th century by German-Chilean archaeologist Max Uhl. He was excavating along the arid coastal sites when he unearthed mummified remains far older than anything expected. At first, the significance wasn't fully understood. These weren't pharaohs or priests. They weren't encased in gold. But as carbon dating advanced, a stunning truth emerged. The Chinchorro mummies predate Egypt's earliest mummification by nearly 2,000 years. Today, Chinchorro sites have been found in areas like Arica, Camerones, and Caleta Vitor. Dozens of mummies have been recovered, studied, and displayed. And yet, many still lie beneath the sand awaiting the archaeologist's brush, or perhaps better left undisturbed. So you imagine the desert again. The sun beats down, the wind shifts the sand. And beneath the surface, wrapped in mud or manganese, lie bodies preserved by hands long vanished. They are not royalty. They ruled no kingdom, but they were loved, remembered, painted with care. They speak not of conquest or glory, but of connection, of a people who held their dead close. And as you ponder this, the question settles softly, like dust on the wind. What does it say about a people not how they died, but how they chose to remember? The wind carries salt from the Pacific and dust from the desert. A reed mat is rolled back. Beneath it lies the carefully preserved body of a child blackened with manganese paste, wrapped in reed fiber, eyes modeled in white clay. The child is not buried, not hidden. He is present. Nearby, women grind shellfish. A man mends a net. No one screams. No one turns away. He has been there for weeks, perhaps months. In the world of the Chinchorro, the dead were not separated from the living. They were not banished to graves. They remained seated, wrapped, and displayed participants in the rhythms of life. In this section, we explore how Chinchorro mummies existed within communities, not apart from them. We uncover clues that suggest these preserved bodies were not static icons of mourning, but relational objects interwoven with family memory, spiritual ritual, and the fragile continuity of life along the edge of the sea. Keeping the dead close. Excavations along the coastal valleys of the Atacama have revealed something remarkable. Chinchorro mummies were often found not in cemeteries, but beneath homes, beside hearths, or grouped together in shallow, sandy clusters. Some appear to have been kept for extended periods, with evidence of rewrapping, repainting, and repositioning. Limbs were sometimes reattached. Broken skulls were repaired. These weren't bodies left to deteriorate, they were maintained, as if still part of daily life. In some cases, archaeologists discovered multiple mummies within a single household, suggesting familial or communal care. Traces of fresh pigment applied to old mummies, indicating ongoing interaction. Carefully arranged groupings of children and adults, possibly indicating generational continuity or shared ritual significance. What emerges is not a picture of a funeral, but of continued presence. The dead did not leave, they stayed. Rituals of continuity. So what happened with these mummies? Were they worshipped, cared for as ancestors, feared? There is no direct evidence, no writings, no spoken memories, but patterns suggest that the Chinchorro performed rituals involving the dead. Some possibilities include seasonal ceremonies, where mummies were brought out of storage, displayed, or paraded. Evidence of pigments and clay suggests that bodies were repainted, perhaps ritually refreshed. Healing or fertility rites, with mummies acting as intercessors, spiritual agents who could be called upon in times of illness or misfortune. Initiation practices, where youths or family members were introduced to ancestors through contact with the mummies. Unlike Egyptian tombs or Mayan crypts, the Chinchorro made no monumental tombs. Their preservation was not about spectacle, it was about connection. A child who died young might be kept by his mother, wrapped in painted fiber, his features preserved in clay. She might sing to him, rock him, paint his face again when it faded. This is not necromancy. This is grief given form and honored over time. The dead as symbols of life. Interestingly, Chinchorro mummification reached its peak during times of environmental stability when fish were plentiful and communities were growing. This counters a common assumption that cultures turn toward death rituals during periods of collapse. The Chinchorro, it seems, engaged most deeply with the dead when life was flourishing. Why? Anthropologists suggest that mummification may have been part of social cohesion. In a world without kings, temples, or writing, shared rituals around the dead may have provided communal identity. Mummies became physical representations of lineage, belonging, or territory. Their presence may have been a form of spiritual insurance, a way to bind generations together across time. In an egalitarian society, where hierarchy was minimal, perhaps the only claim to permanence was in the careful tending of those who had passed. It is also possible that mummies helped to bridge memory. In a preliterate culture, a preserved body may have served as the only tangible link to the past: a grandmother's hand, a child's face, a painted mask bearing the clay imprint of an individual long gone. The labor of care. Mummification among the Chinchorro was not simple, nor was it standardized. The process could take days, even weeks. Bodies were dismantled, cleaned, dried, and rebuilt. Clay was molded, paint applied, wigs fashioned from human hair. Some were filled with reeds, others with ash or wool. This was intimate labor. Hands that once washed the child now shaped his clay eyelids. A father's bones might be rearranged by his daughter, his torso painted with manganese from a cave 2 valleys away. And this labor was repeated. Some mummies were reopened, repaired, their paint renewed. In this, we see something rare in ancient cultures: the temporal extension of mourning. Death was not a moment, but a season, possibly a lifetime, and care for the dead mirrored care for the living. Faces and masks. One of the most arresting features of Chinchorro mummies is their faces. Many had facial masks molded from clay, sometimes painted in geometric patterns. Eyes were shaped into gentle ovals. Mouths were often closed, serene. Hair, when preserved, was sometimes arranged in elaborate wigs or braided cords. These faces are not grotesque. They are not meant to frighten. They appear peaceful. Some scholars argue that the masks were not simply artistic, but served to humanize the mummies, restoring identity lost in death. Others see them as spiritual avatars, allowing the soul to inhabit a visible form. Perhaps both. To make a face is to see someone, to remember them, and for the Chinchorro to sculpt that face in clay was an act of reverence, a statement: you are still known. Evidence of community interaction. In several archaeological sites, groups of mummies have been found together, as if arranged for a viewing or ritual. Some were seated, others laid flat. They show signs of having been handled over time: worn paint, shifted limbs, repairs. This suggests public ritual, not just private grief. The dead may have been carried during festivals or processions, displayed during seasonal changes, fishing cycles, or community gatherings, brought forward to mark births, deaths, or changes in leadership. This living dead dynamic is rare in ancient archaeology. Most cultures separate the dead. They bury, burn, or elevate. The Chinchorro did the opposite. They blurred the line. And in doing so, they offer us an entirely different way of seeing death, not as exile, but as enduring presence. Silent legacy. The Chinchorro left no temples, no great statues, no carved calendars or priestly scripts. Their legacy is written in bones and paint, in clay masks and stitched mats. They were not an empire. They did not conquer, but they remembered patiently, carefully, tenderly. And that, perhaps, is the most human legacy of all. Their mummies are now held in museums, studied by scientists, occasionally displayed behind glass, but their meaning still resists easy explanation. Are they ancestors, icons, art? Or are they reminders that the human impulse to remember is older than history itself? So you imagine, again, that coastal house. The wind scratches the walls. The mother smooths clay across the child's cheek. Outside, waves slap the shore. A fisherman whistles. A grandmother sews a net. The child does not move, but he is still there. And as you ponder this moment, far removed and yet uncannily familiar, a quiet question emerges. What happens to a society that never lets go because it never believes it must. The desert is patient. It covers everything slowly, silently. Wind-blown grains drift into eye sockets, coat ribs, bury hands shaped from clay. What the Chinchorro left behind, the Atacama tried to reclaim, and for thousands of years it almost succeeded. But not completely. In this final section of the Chinchorro story, we uncover how these ancient mummies were found again. We explore the modern science that has revealed their secrets, the threats they now face, and the global movement to protect a culture that wrote no words, built no temples, but remembered its dead with a gentleness history has rarely matched. Their story was almost lost. But dust, it turns out, is not the same as forgetting. Rediscovery in the 20th century. The first documented discovery of Chinchorro mummies occurred in 1917, when German-Chilean archaeologist Max Uhl uncovered desiccated bodies while excavating burial sites near Arica, a coastal town in northern Chile. At first, Uhl and others assumed they had stumbled upon naturally preserved remains common in the arid Atacama, but closer inspection revealed cut marks, pigment, stuffing materials, and elaborate reconstructions. These were no accidents of nature. They were deliberate, ritualistic, and astonishingly ancient. Yet the full significance of the Chinchorro mummies remained largely unrecognized for decades. Other discoveries followed in Cameroon's Valley, Caleta Vitor, and Azapa, but few outside of the region paid attention. Only with the development of radiocarbon dating in the late 20th century did the world realize the magnitude of what had been found. Mummies older than Egypt's. A culture of preservation without monuments or empires. An alternate history of death. Science and secrets beneath the clay. Modern technologies, CT scans, DNA analysis, isotopic sampling have deepened our understanding of the Chinchorro. Radiocarbon dating has placed the earliest artificial mummies around 5000 BCE, over 2,000 years before Egypt's first embalmed pharaohs. DNA studies reveal genetic links between Chinchorro populations and Andean highland communities, suggesting complex migration and trade networks. Isotopic analysis of hair and bone indicates a marine-heavy diet. Up to 90% of their protein came from fish and shellfish. Microarchaeology has revealed fine pigments, plant fibers, and deliberate tool marks on bones and skulls. These studies do more than date the mummies. They tell stories of disease, of ritual injury, of repeated repair and care. One infant mummy, for example, showed signs of having been repainted multiple times, its limbs repositioned over months. Another was buried with a fishing hook, perhaps a parent's tool, left as a token. In these details, we find lives, not just remains. A UNESCO World Heritage treasure. In 2021, the Chinchorro archaeological sites were added to the UNESCO World Heritage List, recognizing their global significance. The designation included settlement and burial sites in Arica and Parinacota region, Chile. Collections of black, red, and mud-coated mummies. Living traces of one of humanity's earliest complex mortuary cultures. The designation was more than ceremonial. It provided funds, resources, and international attention. The San Miguel de Azapa Archaeological Museum, near Arica, now houses one of the largest Chinchorro collections, and curators are working to preserve the delicate remains under tightly controlled environmental conditions. Yet challenges remain. Threats to the ancient dead. Despite the desert's dryness, the mummies are fragile. Many have begun to decompose rapidly since excavation, ironically, because of modern environments. Increased humidity from urban development and air conditioning has accelerated microbial decay. Pollution and handling have introduced new contaminants. Tourism, while beneficial for awareness, has brought exposure to light, temperature shifts, and movement. In some cases, mummies preserved for 7,000 years have deteriorated in just a few decades. Scientists now race against time to catalog, conserve, and stabilize the remains using vacuum-sealed cases, climate-controlled rooms, and digital scanning. But many mummies still lie unexcavated, beneath layers of sand, in remote valleys and coastal ridges. Some argue they should remain there. Not everything must be uncovered. Cultural reconnection. In recent years, descendants of the region's indigenous peoples, Aymara and Atacameño communities, have begun reclaiming the Chinchorro legacy. Though direct cultural continuity is debated, many local families feel a connection to the ancestral dead. Ceremonies, exhibits, and school programs have begun to integrate Chinchorro history not as artifact, but as heritage. In Arica, students now learn about the black and red mummies not in the abstract, but as part of their own story. And for some, the message is profound. That a culture with no writing still left a voice. That a people without power left behind something more lasting than conquest, a record of care. Lessons from the Chinchorro. What does the Chinchorro legacy mean for us? In an age where death is sterilized, hidden behind hospital walls and funeral parlors, the Chinchorro remind us of another approach, one that welcomes the dead into life. They show us that the oldest preserved dead were not kings, but children, mothers, fishermen. That preservation need not be grand to be sacred. That to remember is not always to enshrine, but sometimes just to keep close. In a time when ancient Egypt captivates us with its gold and grandeur, the Chinchorro offers something subtler, a humble intimacy with mortality. Not temples but mats, not tombs but hands. Final reflections. So you picture it again. A child dies in a fishing hut 7,000 years ago. Her family, devastated, does not bury her. They clean her, paint her, fill her limbs with reeds. Her face is shaped from clay. They sit beside her for weeks, maybe months. When they move to a new place, they carry her with them. She is not just gone, she is transformed. And you, thousands of years later, see that same face through a glass case. The clay is cracked, the pigment faded, but something remains. A stillness, a presence, and maybe in that moment, the most ancient feeling of all, the desire not to forget.